Despite taking a punch filled with incredible strength, Jung-hyuk was still conscious. His eyes remained open, yet there was no movement. It was almost as if he had fainted with his eyes still staring ahead. Dokja hesitated, wondering if his strike had been too strong. But no, he knew this wouldn't be the last time he would have to face Jung-hyuk like this. There would be more fights ahead. Standing over Jung-hyuk's injured form, Dokja observed his swollen face. His opponent would be in trouble if he continued acting the way he always had. This constant declaration to kill him upon sight. It was reckless. Dokja raised his hand and lightly slapped Jung-hyuk's battered face. A strange feeling crept over him as he noticed the slightest flicker in Jung-hyuk's eyes every time he struck. It made him uneasy, but there was no doubt. The man was still breathing. As the tense moment lingered, the ward floating in the air slowly faded. Then, a cascade of notifications filled Dokja's vision. Some of the constellations were satisfied with the fight, applauding his perseverance and willpower. Others, however, bore a grudge, clearly displeased with his actions. Their divided reactions only reinforced the weight of the battle he had just fought. Then the mid-level dokkaebi reappeared, his voice carrying a mixture of amusement and finality. He announced with exaggerated delight that the underdog had won. It was over, and with this victory, a new ruler of the throne had been decided. A murmur spread through the crowd. The incarnations of Soul whispered among themselves as they turned their eyes toward Dokja, standing at the center of it all. The realization settled in. He was the one. Their questions overlapped in hushed voices, wondering which area he had come from. The dokkaebi, delighted by the outcome, laughed as he declared the conclusion, but before the announcement could fully settle, Dokja interrupted. He spoke up, stopping the dokkaebi from rushing ahead. He pointed out that the announcement had been made before he had even taken his place on the throne. The dokkaebi observed Dokja closely, stating with certainty that he would take the throne anyway, but Dokja hesitated, staring at the seat of power before him. He considered its purpose, wondering what true authority it granted him. The dokkaebi responded with confidence, explaining that the throne would allow him to make others obey his commands. As long as he remained seated, he would become the absolute ruler of the territory under his control. Still, Dokja wasn't convinced. Was that all? The dokkaebi seemed puzzled by his response, but Dokja pressed further. The offer sounded too perfect, too simple. The promise of complete control over the land seemed too good to be true. The dokkaebi assured him that this was merely the reward for his efforts. He had risked his life to reach this moment, and now he was receiving what he rightfully deserved. But Dokja was never one to accept things at face value. If the throne granted him such overwhelming power, did that mean it could override the very laws of plausibility? His voice carried a sharp edge as he pointed out the absurdity of it all. He accused the dokkaebi of lying, calling out his kind for their trickery. Surely there were rules in place to prevent such blatant deception. The dokkaebi's amusement faded, replaced by growing frustration. His voice darkened as he warned Dokja not to argue. The scenario had to end, and the only way forward was for him to take his seat. If Dokja continued to resist, then the throne itself would simply be destroyed. But Dokja remained unfazed. His answer was unexpected. He didn't care if the throne was destroyed. The words hung in the air, defying the very foundation of the scenario. The dokkaebi's laughter rang out, sharp and filled with disbelief. But before he could say more, Dokja turned his gaze toward the other kings who had been watching. His next words sent a shockwave through the silent battlefield. He refused. He would not sit on the ruler's throne. A dreadful stillness consumed Gwanghwamun. Overhead, dark clouds rolled in, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The distant sound of thunder rumbled across the sky as if the heavens themselves reacted to his defiance. The gathered incarnations stood frozen in place, their expressions blank with disbelief. The downpour intensified, soaking everything in cold, heavy sheets, yet no one spoke a word. The dokkaebi's fury exploded through the air. His voice, filled with rage, demanded an explanation. Had he really just refused? Dokja stood firm, his expression unreadable. The answer did not change. He was not going to sit on the throne. The dokkaebi could not comprehend his stubbornness. His frustration grew as he tried to make Dokja understand. Without the ruler's throne, the Soul Dome would never survive the fifth scenario. The other kings erupted in frustration. Their patience had run dry, and they could not comprehend Dokja's refusal. Some shouted for him to stop being stubborn and simply take the throne. Others, blinded by ambition, declared that if he would not, then they would seize the opportunity themselves. The dokkaebi's voice rang out again, this time filled with temptation. The throne was more than just a seat of power. It was a gateway to greatness. Simply sitting upon it would grant him everything he could desire. He would ascend to the status of a fable, and the constellation that had promised him sponsorship would rise even higher in rank. The dokkaebi warned him that he was not as easy to deceive as the lower grade ones. Trickery would not work on him. Dokja understood the weight of those words. The fifth scenario would be incredibly difficult to clear without the ruler's throne. That much was true. But there was something the dokkaebi wasn't saying. If he used the power of the throne even once, there would be no turning back. He would never be able to reach the end of the scenario. In the novel, Jung-hyuk had only realized this truth in his 41st regression. One of the men in the crowd, unable to contain his agitation, stepped forward. The disbelief in his voice was clear. Why would anyone refuse to be king? Dokja turned his gaze toward the man. Instead of answering directly, he posed a question of his own. Why did they even want him as their ruler? The man hesitated, confused by the unexpected response. But Dokja did not stop there. He pushed forward, driving his point deeper. What if he took the throne and simply killed them all afterward? Had they not considered that possibility? Did they forget that they once lived in a democratic society? Why were they now so eager to submit themselves as subjects of a kingdom? More than anything, he had no desire to rule over them. That was why he would never sit on the ruler's throne. Lifting his gaze to the stormy sky, Dokja made his stance even clearer. He would never sign with any of the worthless constellations watching this scenario unfold. And more than that, he would make sure no one else took the throne either. With a shift in his stance, he tightened his grip on his blade. The dokkaebi's patience had reached its limit. His tone darkened as he warned Dokja that this was enough. But Dokja's voice only grew louder, filled with an intensity that silenced the crowd. He turned his words not only to the humans standing before him, but also to the constellations watching from above. How much longer would they let the dokkaebi control them through their endless scenarios? Did they even understand what it truly meant for someone to sit on the ruler's throne? And this message was not just for them, it was directed at the constellations of Korea as well. Dokja knew the truth. Not all constellations were the same. Some held greater power than others, but had they not already done enough? How much longer would this land be forced to suffer because of their endless conflicts? They called it history. They sought to become historical constellations, crafting legends to build themselves up as fabled existences. But then what? After reaching the highest rank, after shining as the brightest star in the sky, what came next? How much longer would their descendants be forced to endure suffering, all so they could satisfy their own ambitions? The dokkaebi's frustration reached its peak. With a snap of his fingers, he declared that he would not allow this defiance to continue. A flicker of notifications filled the air as a new sub-scenario was issued. The objective was clear: subdue Incarnation Dokja Kim, who refused to take the throne and claim the ruler's throne for oneself. Dokja had expected this outcome. He knew the nature of the people around him. No matter how much his words had shaken them, in the end, the dokkaebi was right. When given the choice, they would sell their conscience for a handful of coins. The very same people who had hesitated before were now stepping forward, their eyes filled with greed. As they moved, Heewon slid in front of Dokja, standing firm. Her stance made it clear. If they wanted to reach him, they would have to go through her first. Despite the tension, Minsub turned toward Dokja with a strange remark. It was as if, for a moment, he believed Dokja to be the true protagonist of Ways of Survival, rather than Jung-hyuk. Sunguk, standing beside him, agreed, noting that Jung-hyuk would never do something so reckless. Senga, however, held a different perspective. No matter how much the world changed, there were certain values that should never be abandoned. That was what she truly believed. Among those watching were two significant figures: Min Jae-won, the King of Beauty, and Cha Sang-kyung, the Maitreya King. Dokja did not know which of his words had moved them, but something had shifted. There was a change in their eyes, a crack in their previous resolve. Min Jae-won was the first to step forward. Even if it was only this once, she had decided to stand by his side. Cha Sang-kyung followed soon after, stating that he could tell through his ability to read minds that Dokja had spoken the truth. This turn of events was unexpected. Neither Dokja nor Heewon had anticipated it. For a moment, confusion clouded their expressions as they took in the unexpected support. But the dokkaebi's patience was at its limit. His rage echoed through the space as he looked down upon them, his voice dripping with scorn. To him, they were nothing more than insects struggling in vain. He would enjoy watching them squirm. Without hesitation, the dokkaebi gave the command. At his words, the gathered people roared in unison. Their hesitation vanished, replaced by the single-minded desire to seize power. The crowd surged forward, rushing toward the throne. Heewon pushed through the crowd, forcing her way to Dokja's side. The chaos around them was intensifying, and she knew they had little time. She turned to Dokja, her eyes searching for an answer. She needed to know if he had a plan. Dokja had already made up his mind. The throne had to be destroyed. The length of this new scenario was tied to its existence, and as long as it remained, they would never be free. He instructed Heewon to buy him some time, just enough for him to carry out his plan. Without hesitation, Dokja drew his weapon. A ripple of shock spread through the people watching. Someone recognized it immediately. The S+ grade 4 Yin demonic beheading sword. Its name alone sent a wave of fear through the crowd. But this sword was more than just a powerful weapon. If the right conditions were met, it could be transformed into a star relic. That was because the blade had been forged using the soul of a constellation. Dokja activated activated the special ability of Ganpyeonggi, Echo of the Stars. This ability allowed him to seek the aid of a constellation, something that could tip the scales in this battle. He had already decided which constellations to call upon. With unwavering resolve, Dokja summoned the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, Tamlang, Geoman, Nokjeon, Mungok, Yeomjong, and the 6th star, Mugok. The atmosphere around him shifted. A notification flickered in his vision. 6 constellations had turned their attention toward him. Their presence bore down on him, immense and overwhelming. The voices of the constellations echoed in his mind, their words laced with concern and disapproval. They questioned his decision. If he summoned all of them, his mind would not survive. They warned him of the dangers, asking why he would choose the hardest path when an easier way was available. As their presence grew stronger, Dokja felt his body weaken. The weight of their power pressed down on him, making it difficult to breathe. His vision blurred, and the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. It trickled from his nose and ears, a sign that his body was reaching its limit, but he could not stop now. To use the full power of the 4-yin demonic beheading sword, he needed to call upon one more constellation. Yet something was wrong. The special ability of Ganpyeonggi could no longer be activated. The realization struck him like a blade. He had reached the limit, but Dokja was not one to back down so easily. There was still another way. The answer lay in an item. The Dragon Jar, a reward taken by the Tyrant King from the 7-man dungeon. With no other choice, Dokja made his decision. By sacrificing the S-grade 3-wheeled ring, he would recharge the usage count on the S-grade Ganpyeonggi. Dokja sacrificed the item without hesitation. The Dragon Jar released a mysterious energy, filling the air with an ominous glow. A message appeared before him. The S-grade 3-ring loop had disappeared as a sacrifice, and the S-grade Ganpyeonggi had gained one more use. With the final chance at his disposal, Dokja activated Ganpyeonggi once again. This time, he called upon the last of the 7 stars. As he did, the 7th star of the Big Dipper, Pagan, answered his call. The 7 stars now shone together, their presence filling the sky with an overwhelming radiance. The Big Dipper had fully gathered, and their power surged through the space around him. Their voices rang in unison, questioning his request. Dokja did not hesitate. He wanted to sever the connection between the throne and its owner. He pleaded for their sword, knowing that only their power could accomplish this. The 7 stars, however, did not give their answer so easily. They warned him of the consequences, questioning whether he truly understood what he was asking. But Dokja had already made his decision. The ruler's throne, the reward of the 4th scenario, was more than just a seat of power. It granted the ability to borrow the strength of a ruler from the dark dimension. Such a force would allow him to control Junghyuk and neutralize his enemies. But in exchange, the world itself would be doomed. The cost of wielding such power was the end of everything. Even constellations hesitated to be involved in this matter. The 7 stars saw him as nothing more than a mortal who dared to challenge the throne's true owner. To them, it was absurd that a mere human would attempt such a thing. Dokja, however, had no intention of fighting the throne's master. He only wanted to break the connection. That was all. The stars remained firm. They warned him once more. The plausibility of his actions was beyond his limits. If he went through with this, he would not survive. But Dokja had no room for doubt. The decision was his to make, and he had already chosen. In response, the Big Dipper blazed with an intense brilliance. Their celestial marks engraved themselves onto the 4-yin demonic beheading sword. A dazzling light wrapped around the blade, and flames erupted from it, burning with a divine fury. The scene left the dokkaebi and the surrounding people frozen in disbelief. None of them could comprehend the sight before them. The 7 stars acknowledged his determination. They accepted his choice. Even if he were to die here, they promised that his existence would not be forgotten. Dokja knew the true nature of the 4-yin demonic beheading sword. Unlike an ordinary weapon, it was designed for rituals, capable of severing the connection between a constellation's artifact and its owner. This was the sword's real power, one of the few that could cut such a deep-rooted tie. Some might believe that taking the ruler's throne and becoming king would be the easiest way to clear the remaining scenarios, but Dokja knew better. Without hesitation, Dokja swung the sword at the absolute throne. A deafening sound echoed as fire flared upon impact. The force of the strike sent shockwaves through the air, shaking the very ground beneath him. From the chaos, Heewon's urgent voice rang out, urging him to hurry, but Dokja had already lost himself in his task. His body moved instinctively, fueled by sheer determination. He attacked again and again, again, his strikes relentless. Each swing carried his will, his rejection of the easy path, his refusal to be bound by a story dictated by others. Some believed that ruling from the throne would make survival easier, but Dokja knew that such naive thinking would never lead to the true end. He did not care about the expectations of others. The story he wanted to tell was different. The throne began to crack. The once indestructible structure weakened under the repeated blows. Dokja wielded the sword like a madman, ignoring the damage to the blade itself. Sparks scattered as the edge dulled and fractured. Yet, he did not stop. Finally, the breaking point arrived. The sword shattered, but so did the throne. A notification flickered before him, confirmation of his success. The link between the constellation and the star relic had been severed. The sub-scenario had ended. Somewhere beyond his reach, an unknown god had taken notice of the shift in this world. The absolute throne, once a seat of immense power, now stood as nothing more than an ordinary chair, its brilliance completely lost. The dokkaebi's anger erupted like a violent storm. His voice thundered through the air, filled with rage at what had just happened. His fury was palpable, as if he could tear the world apart in his frustration. Dokja coughed violently, blood spilling from his lips. The unbearable strain of what he had just done was taking its toll. Above him, the 7 stars shone once more, their voices echoing through his mind. The burden of plausibility was about to crash down on him, and he had to be prepared. Deep inside his thoughts, Dokja reassured himself. Everything had to be believable for a story to unfold. He had done everything within his power to ensure this moment seemed plausible. Yet, even with all his preparation, the pain was beyond anything he had imagined. A force unlike anything he had ever felt began pulling at him. His entire being was stretched to its limits, as if something essential was being torn from his soul. The unbearable pressure crushed him, leaving him barely clinging to consciousness. The dokkaebi watched the scene with a wicked grin, his eyes alight with cruel delight. He reveled in Dokja's suffering, knowing that such an act would not go unpunished. The price had to be paid. Agony tore through Dokja's body. A scream escaped his throat as it felt like his very existence was unraveling. His veins burned as if molten fire coursed through them. Blood gushed from his mouth, and his body convulsed under the strain. From the side, Hiwin and Sanga watched helplessly, their eyes filled with despair. They could do nothing but witness the torment that had taken hold of him. Then, through the overwhelming pain, a distant light shone in the night sky. A single star glowed softly, its presence calm and unwavering. It was a gaze that held understanding, a quiet support that reached him in his suffering. One by one, more stars began to shine. The maritime war god turned his attention to Dokja, watching him with a steady gaze. Then came another, bald general of justice, and another, last hero of Hwangsan-beol. More stars lit up, their presence growing stronger with each passing moment. With every additional star, the crushing pain lessened. Dokja felt their light wrapping around him, sharing the unbearable weight that had been forced upon him. The impossibility of his actions was becoming reality. What had been deemed an implausible event was now being rewritten as something that could exist within the story. The Big Dipper too added its strength to his, acknowledging the path he had chosen. Their combined presence stabilized him, easing the burden he had taken upon himself. The mid-level dokkaebi's excitement faltered as he noticed the messages from the constellations. Confusion flashed across his face as he questioned the sudden change. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Why would the stars intervene for someone like Dokja? The 7 stars gazed upon him once more. Their presence, firm and unwavering, acknowledged the story he had chosen to create. This was the tale he wanted to tell, and they would bear witness to it. Notifications flickered across the sky, marking the abrupt end of the 4th scenario. A new message appeared, announcing something unprecedented. Dokja had achieved a non-existent achievement. A narrative had been born, shaping itself into something that had never existed before. The story, King of a Kingless World, had come into being, and with it, the possibility of a new stigma had been granted. Dokja lifted his gaze toward the swirling clouds above the Great Hole. The storm that raged overhead mirrored the turmoil in the world below. He steadied himself, his breath heavy, blood dripping from his nose as exhaustion crept over him. There was no next regression for him. He had decided this was where the story would end. The dokkaebi stepped forward, his expression twisted in anger. His presence alone seemed to darken the air around him. His fury was undeniable, his voice laced with venom. What had happened was something he could not ignore. Dokja, despite his pain, found amusement in the dokkaebi's reaction. Deep inside, he smirked at the outcome. This level of rage only meant one thing. He had won this round. He had successfully carved a fable into the narrative during the fourth scenario, just as he had planned. Around him, the people stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. The weight of the situation settled over them like a crushing force. Their minds raced with questions, confusion evident in their eyes. The throne had been destroyed. Why? What purpose did it serve? Their shock quickly turned to frustration, their voices rising in desperation. They demanded answers, their fear driving them to seek a solution. They turned to the dokkaebi, pleading for another ruler's throne, eager to restart the scenario and elect a new ruler. But the dokkaebi's response was absolute. The scenario had ended. There would be no redo, no second chance. The fate of everyone now rested on the consequences of what had transpired. Whatever awaited them from this point forward was because of one person, Dokja. Dokja recognized the shift in the dokkaebi's tone. He knew exactly what was happening. The dokkaebi was shifting the blame onto him, directing the anger of the survivors toward a single target. A quiet amusement flickered within Dokja's thoughts. That bastard, the dokkaebi still seething, snapped his fingers. A low hum vibrated through the air, an eerie sense of foreboding settling over the area. His gaze locked onto Dokja with a cruel glint. If this world was to be without a king, then so be it. He would enjoy watching how long Dokja could survive in such a place. Then, the world around them began to unravel. People in Gwanghwamun started to vanish like smoke, their figures fading into nothingness. Panic spread instantly. Cries of terror echoed through the ruined city as people scrambled, trying to understand what was happening. Their screams filled the air, fear gripping them as the world they knew was being rewritten before their eyes. The dokkaebi's final words lingered like a curse. This was only the beginning. Now, in a world without a king, survival would be the ultimate test. Dokja turned back, hearing the desperate voices of Hiwon, Senga, Gilyong, and the others calling out to him. But before he could respond, they began to vanish. First, Senga disappeared, then Gilyong. Hiwon followed, and soon, Minsub and Sunguk were gone too. Within seconds, the battlefield of Gwanghwamun, once filled with chaos and struggle, became eerily silent. Only Dokja remained, surrounded by lifeless bodies, the corpses piled up around him in an unspoken testament to what had taken place. A creeping sense of isolation wrapped around him, but the dokkaebi's presence cut through the silence. A cold fury settled in Dokja's chest. He wanted to speak, to defy the words thrown at him, but the dokkaebi only smiled wider. Before Dokja could react, a snap of fingers echoed through the air. A sudden force gripped him, his body shuddering as the world twisted. He felt himself being pulled, moved elsewhere against his will. The dokkaebi's laughter rang out, a sound that reverberated all around him, lingering even as everything blurred. The last words he heard carried an unsettling promise. He was being watched, and the dokkaebi would take pleasure in seeing just how long he could last. A system notification flickered before his fading consciousness that 10,000 coins have been earned as settlement for the fourth scenario. Dokja barely registered the message. His body had reached its limit. His energy was drained, his mind slipping into unconsciousness. The strain from excessive contact with the constellations weighed heavily on him, and the exhaustion was unbearable. Then darkness. He slept for what felt like an eternity, his body seeking rest it had long been denied. His mind was not at peace. A memory surfaced, a time before the scenarios. A voice called out to him, one he hadn't heard in years. The realization struck instantly. This was his past. High school. The moment he became aware, so did the pain. He remembered the gangsters, the ones who had tormented him without reason. Laughter surrounded him, sharp and mocking. A hand grabbed his collar, shoving him back. His body ached from the beatings, his limbs weak, his mind clouded with frustration. More jeers followed, each word laced with cruelty. They spoke his name with disdain, their amusement growing as they sneered at his helplessness. Then, the insult that cut deeper than any wound. They mentioned his mother. Rough fingers tightened around his throat, cutting off his air. He coughed, struggling against the suffocating grip. Blood dripped from his cracked lips, the taste of iron filling his mouth. His teeth clenched, his hands curled into fists. And then, a thought surfaced. If only he were Junghyuk. If only he had Junghyuk's strength. That was what he had once believed. Back then, while reading Ways of Survival, he had drowned himself in foolish daydreams. He had imagined himself as someone stronger, someone who could fight back, someone who could change his fate. But that had never been his reality. Now, in this fragmented dream, a name slipped into his mind. Sung Minu. What had become of him? The one who had tormented others had gone on to live a successful life. A good university, a well-paying job. Life had handed him everything despite the misery he had caused others. Life was unfair. Had Sung Minu survived the scenarios, or had he become just another nameless casualty in a rewritten world that cared nothing for justice? A sudden force rippled through Dokja's mind as his personal skill, Fourth Wall, activated. The dream shattered in an instant, light, collapsing into darkness. The illusion of the past faded, leaving only emptiness behind. Then, a new sensation stirred. A notification flickered that the exclusive skill, Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint, has been activated. Voices emerged from the void, layered and overlapping. Some were frantic, others filled with confusion. They called out, their words floating in the dark. They were voices he recognized. Heewon stood before a bar, surrounded by shelves stocked with different types of wine. A deep frown marred her face as she sighed. Jihei, on the other hand, looked around with irritation, rubbing her head as if she had been struck. The unfamiliar surroundings unsettled her. Of all places, she had been transported to a school. Hyunsung was somewhere different altogether. He stood within a military base, his expression marked with disbelief. The weight of the situation pressed down on him as he tried to understand why he had ended up there. The realization dawned upon Dokja. Everyone had been teleported to places connected to their personal history. The mid-level dokkaebi had orchestrated solo scenarios for each of them, isolating them from one another. Even if these events were separate from the main scenario, the dokkaebi would still bear responsibility for interfering in such a manner. His thoughts solidified. He needed to reach them. He needed to find them before anything else happened. But no matter how much he willed his words to reach them, a lingering doubt remained. Could they even hear him? As if answering his question, the voices faded, and a notification flickered that Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint has been deactivated. The sensation of floating disappeared. Dokja's awareness returned to his body, and a slow heaviness settled over him as his consciousness surfaced. His eyelids fluttered open. Dark clouds loomed above, twisting in the sky like an abyss, their presence lingering over Seoul. They churned unnaturally, an ominous force spiraling through the heavens. Dokja pushed himself up, shaking off the remnants of exhaustion. As he took in his surroundings, the realization struck him. This was a panoramic view of Seoul. Tall buildings stretched out below him, their glass and steel structures reflecting the dim light from above. Recognition settled over him like a heavy weight. This was Mino Soft, the company he once worked for. Staring at the empty sky above Seoul, of all places, he had ended up here. The company where he had spent years drowning in monotony, enduring his manager's scoldings, and escaping to this very rooftop to clear his head. He remembered how he used to stand here with Deputy Yun, exchanging tired words about work, about life, about nothing in particular. It had been a place of small respite in a dull existence. Now it was just another ruin in a collapsing world. A thought crossed his mind. Was Yun still alive? Before he could dwell on it, glowing messages flickered in the air, displaying new information. The fifth scenario, the Great Hole, would begin in 10 days. With the destruction of the Absolute Throne, Seoul Dome had been given a temporary reprieve, a brief window before the next disaster arrived. But even this grace period came with a price. A sub-scenario had already appeared. Its conditions clear. Survive in the ruined city for 10 days. Failure means death. It was just as he had expected. The flow of events had not changed. But this challenge, if approached correctly, could serve a purpose. With no immediate threat pressing down, it was the perfect time to gather coins and prepare for what lay ahead. Just as he considered his next move, the distant murmur of voices reached his ears. The words were hurried, spoken in an urgent whisper before breaking into action. Dokja turned his gaze toward the source of the commotion. A group of people emerged from the shadows, their movements calculated, their intentions unknown. Something wasn't right. There was no king in the Seocho-gu area, which meant this place likely belonged to the Wanderers, survivors without allegiance, living on the fringes of society, scavenging what they could. If that was the case, they might not be hostile, but it was too soon to take chances. He needed information. He reached for his smartphone, intending to check any updates about the area's current state. But as he pressed the power button, nothing happened. The screen remained dark as the battery was dead. An inconvenience, but not an impossible one. He needed to find a power bank, either in the office or somewhere nearby. With no time to waste, he pushed open the rooftop door and stepped inside, descending the stairs into the deserted floors of Mino Soft. The silence was suffocating. As he walked through the abandoned office, the weight of familiarity pressed down on him. He had once spent countless hours here, moving between cubicles, enduring the endless cycle of work and exhaustion. Now everything was still, frozen in time. Despite himself, an odd feeling stirred within him. Nostalgia. He had spent years resenting this place, yet now, in the midst of a crumbling world, he found himself missing it. Shaking off the thought, he moved toward the desks, pulling open drawers one by one, searching for a spare battery. There had to be one left behind. behind, something useful among the remnants of his past. Just as he reached for another drawer, a sudden beam of light cut through the darkness. His body tensed. Someone was here. The flashlight hovered for a moment before settling on him. A figure stood in the doorway, tense, their stance defensive. The sharpness in their posture made it clear. They were ready to fight if necessary. Then, a voice broke the silence, cautious yet familiar. The hesitation lasted only a second as recognition flickered across the stranger's face, and the once rigid stance softened. Dokja's voice, filled with disbelief, it was Deputy Yun. The relief in Yun's voice was undeniable as he took a step forward, struggling to process the reality in front of him. Dokja was alive, and without waiting for questions, Yun began explaining everything that had happened in Minosoft since the world had fallen apart. The first scenario had been merciless. Every employee working overtime that night had been dragged into the nightmare without warning, and then, as if recalling something vivid, he spoke of Mr. Kim, the superior who had spent years making their lives miserable. In that moment of chaos, Yun had killed him with his own hands, stabbing his neck with a pen. The memory seemed almost surreal to him, as if he had been inside a game rather than real life. Dokja listened in silence, momentarily unsettled by the excitement in Yun's tone. There was something chilling about the way he spoke, as if the weight of killing had already lost its meaning. Realizing how he must have sounded, Yun hesitated before apologizing. He hadn't meant to make Dokja uncomfortable. Pushing past the moment, Dokja shifted the conversation, asking if Yun was alone. At first, Yun seemed caught off guard, then quickly clarified that he had joined a group of survivors. His tone grew more curious as he turned the question back on Dokja. Had he been in the building all this time? Did he belong to a group? Was he actively clearing the main scenario? Dokja gave a vague response, revealing only that he had been in the Gwanghwamun area and that something had happened. Yun absorbed the information before shaking his head with a knowing smile. It seemed that Dokja's luck was as terrible as ever. The comment left Dokja confused. But before he could respond, Yun continued. There was no need to clear scenarios yourself. If one simply stayed hidden, there were always others willing to fight, to struggle, to push forward and complete the challenges in their place. There was no reason to risk one's own life. Dokja frowned slightly, his thoughts lingering on Yun's perspective. The idea of simply hiding, waiting for others to pave the way. It wasn't completely wrong, but something about it felt off. Sensing the shift in mood, Yun chuckled, urging him to relax. The world had fallen into ruin, but it didn't mean one had to live in constant fear. Not everyone needed a king to survive. The Wanderers, people like them, had banded together, forming a group without rulers or hierarchies. With that, they exited Minosoft, stepping into the streets where the Wanderers had gathered. The area was crowded, with figures moving in and out of the ruins, scavenging, watching, waiting. Among them, a few were dragging people away, captives, taken for some unknown purpose. As Dokja observed the scene, an armed man approached, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. His gaze flicked toward Yun, then settled on Dokja before asking who he was. Yun remained calm, introducing Dokja as an old colleague from work, someone he had run into by chance. But the man was not convinced. The Wanderers had rules. No outsiders from other groups were allowed to join without approval. Dokja glanced at the man before asking who he was. Yun sighed before answering. This was the manager of the coin farm. The words struck a chord in Dokja's memory. As if answering his unspoken question, Yun led him further inside. What Dokja saw next was horrifying. Cages were arranged at intervals, placed in an orderly fashion like exhibits in a twisted zoo. Inside them, people were forced to fight, their bodies battered, their faces filled with despair. The crowd surrounding the cages screamed in excitement, their voices merging into a chorus of cruelty. Blood splattered across the ground as one of the captives sobbed, pleading for mercy. But in another cage, the brutality continued. The violence was relentless, the cheers of the spectators growing louder with each blow. As Yun observed the chaotic world around them, a faint smirk appeared on his face. There was an eerie familiarity to it all. In the past, the players had been kings in the video game industry, shaping the market with their preferences. In Minosoft, the CEO had ruled as a king, making decisions that affected everyone beneath him. But now, in this new world of survival, who held that throne? Dokja narrowed his eyes, piecing things together. Yun and his group had found a way to profit from this madness. He asked directly, already suspecting the answer. Were they using the coins given by the constellations? Yun confirmed without hesitation. Some constellations thrived on bloodshed and suffering, rewarding those who fed them entertainment. In exchange for their amusement, they showered the participants with coins, the very currency that determined one's strength and survival. The ones running the coin farm had discovered a way to trade those coins for food, a brutal but effective system. Dokja remained silent, processing what he had just learned. The coin farm had been mentioned in ways of survival, but he had not expected to encounter it this early. From what he could see, the system was still in its infancy, crude and unorganized. The wanderers running it had yet to refine its full potential, but their intentions were clear. Yun glanced at Dokja with an unsettling glint in his eyes. His arrival was perfectly timed. He would get to witness something truly remarkable. Dokja's gaze drifted to the captives and a realization struck him. He recognized them. The prisoners trapped behind iron bars were people from their own company, Mino Soft. The moment Yun acknowledged it with a cold and detached tone, it became clear. The man Dokja had once known as Deputy N no longer existed in this world. Whatever sense of camaraderie he had once held was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. The captives clung to the bars, their voices rising in desperation, pleading, crying, begging. Their words overlapped in a frantic chorus of terror. They wanted to be spared. They wanted to be freed. But Yun's response was far from sympathy. His smirk widened as he recalled an old conversation. One of the prisoners had once said that modern games lack desperation, that players would not spend money on a game unless it truly forced them to. And now, here they were, living proof of that very philosophy. A blade was tossed into the cage, landing near one of the prisoners with a metallic clang. The man inside hesitated, his fingers trembling as he picked it up, unsure of what to do. The atmosphere was thick with expectation, and Yun watched him closely, waiting for him to understand. The prisoner's gaze flickered with confusion as he looked at the familiar faces before him. The head of the department, the deputy manager, the director. These were people he had worked under, people who had held authority over him, but Yun wasn't interested in their titles. His voice, sharp and taunting, pressed the man further. Did he not realize where he was? Did he not remember how these people had treated him? The man stayed silent, his grip tightening on the weapon. Yun continued, reminding him of the injustices he had suffered. The stolen presentation, the endless workload, the exploitation. There was no reason to hesitate. From inside the cage, one of the captives, finally recognizing Yun's voice, stammered in fear. He tried to object, to plead, but the words carried no weight in this place. The prisoner holding the blade seemed lost in thought, but it was clear that the line between survival and vengeance was fading. He had no choice. As the inevitable unfolded, the system responded. A flood of notifications signaled the excitement of the watching constellations. They were entertained, thrilled by the drama being crafted before them. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was a spectacle, a twisted form of storytelling designed to amuse those in the unseen seats of power. Before Dokja could process it further, another voice rang out. More prisoners had been brought in, their captors dragging them through the chaos. There was satisfaction in their tone as they announced the arrival of fresh meat. Among the captives, one figure stood out, a petite individual with pale skin, black hair falling over their shoulders, and slightly raised eyebrows. Dokja rubbed his eyes, but there was no mistaking it. Han Suyong was here. Suyong remained trapped inside the cage while the men around her observed with amusement. They spoke carelessly, discussing her as if she were nothing more than another piece of entertainment. With so many constellations watching, they knew they had to be careful, but that didn't stop them from treating her like a prize to be claimed. They joked among themselves, deciding who would go first, as if this were some twisted game. Dokja watched the scene unfold, his mind racing. If he left Suyong there, she would surely die. But if she lived, she would become a problem. She was one of the few people who knew as much about this world as he did, perhaps even more. However, the scenario had changed in ways she couldn't predict, making much of her knowledge useless. Still, was that a reason to decide whether she should live or die? The thought unsettled him. Who was he to make that choice? Before he could dwell on it further, Yun's voice pulled him back. There was an offer, Suyong's life in exchange for a favor. If Dokja introduced Yun to the group he belonged to, he would hand her over. Yun's group was growing, and they needed more power. He had noticed that Dokja was well prepared and assumed he was part of something bigger. Dokja agreed without hesitation, but before Yun could celebrate, he added a demand of his own. He wanted Yun to stop what he was doing and release the captives. Yun's amusement didn't fade. Instead, he laughed as if Dokja had said something absurd. He reminded Dokja of their past, of how they had known each other for a long time. He spoke about the way Dokja used to be, always reading web novels, always dressed in dark clothing, always distant from others except for a few colleagues like Senga. It wasn't like him to be saying something so righteous. Yun's laughter turned darker, something twisted lurking beneath it. He insisted that Dokja was secretly enjoying this. Weren't they the same? They had been stuck in the QA department together, dismissed as nothing more than lab rats, game testers without real value. But now, now, the people who had once looked down on them were nothing more than tools. They were earning more coins from these captives than they ever could have imagined. Dokja refused to acknowledge it. He had no idea how much they were making, and he didn't care. Yun spoke with excitement, unable to hide his enthusiasm as he revealed just how profitable their system had become. Without needing to clear any scenarios, they were earning 5,000 coins daily. It was the perfect monetization model, just like the systems their company had designed for games. To him, this was the ultimate business: easy, efficient, and endlessly profitable. Before he could continue, a voice interrupted him. A trembling confession shattered the atmosphere. The man inside the cage, the one who had been handed the blade, let it slip from his fingers. His hands shook, his eyes filled with tears as he looked toward Yun and Dokja. He admitted his weakness. He couldn't do it. No matter how much pressure was placed on him, he couldn't bring himself to take another person's life. Yun's expression twisted with frustration. The moment had been ruined. His carefully built spectacle had collapsed, all because of one pathetic man who couldn't follow through. He turned toward the cage, ready to take matters into his own hands. Before he could act, Dokja's firm grip on his shoulder stopped him. There was something colder in Dokja's gaze, something unreadable. If Yun was after coins, Dokja claimed to have a better way. Curiosity flickered in Yun's eyes. He was always looking for ways to make things more thrilling, more profitable. If Dokja had a method to take this to another level, he was willing to listen. His interest only grew as Dokja spoke of using the constellations who enjoyed excitement. Yun's grin widened, fully convinced that Dokja was on his side. He eagerly asked what the plan was. Inside the cage, the captives sobbed quietly, dreading whatever horrific idea would come next. They feared what kind of twisted spectacle Dokja might propose, uncertain whether it would bring them salvation or deeper suffering. Without another word, Dokja drew his blade of faith. The metal gleamed under the dim light as he lifted it, his expression unreadable. Then, with a decisive swing, sparks erupted as the blade cut through the iron bars. A sharp sound echoed through the space as the cage was sliced apart. For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Yun and his companions stood frozen, mouths hanging open in disbelief. They had expected a crueler game, a new way to exploit the weak, but instead, Dokja had shattered their system in a single motion. The captives huddled on the ground, shielding themselves from the flying debris. They had braced for something far worse, unable to process what had just happened. As the last bars fell away, their prison ceased to exist. Shouts of confusion erupted from the surrounding wanderers. Chaos spread as they demanded answers, unable to comprehend why Dokja had done this. Dokja's expression remained cold as he assessed the scene before him. Without hesitation, he launched into a relentless assault. Each swing of his blade shattered the cages, breaking apart the iron bars that confined the victims. One by one, the captives burst free, scrambling out of their prisons, desperate to escape. But Dokja wasn't finished. As some of the wanderers tried to flee, he struck with precision, slicing through their Achilles tendons. Those who had once stood in power, controlling the lives of others, collapsed in agony. Their knees twisted unnaturally as they fell to the ground, unable to run. Yun's voice broke through the chaos, filled with rage and disbelief. He bellowed, demanding to know what Dokja was doing. This was not the turn of events he had expected. Dokja remained calm, meeting Yun's fury with icy detachment. He had simply created a situation that the constellations would love. As if to confirm his words, a series of notifications filled his vision. The constellations were delighted by his actions, showering him with coins in appreciation. There was no need to build a system to farm coins when earning them was this simple. Instead of prolonging the suffering, he had turned the tables in a way that maximized entertainment for the unseen spectators. Yun cursed, his frustration boiling over, but before he could act, a wave of movement rushed toward Dokja. Around 20 wanderers, still standing, charged at him in unison, determined to bring him down. Meanwhile, Suyong remained unconscious in her cage. Dokja moved quickly, shaking her until her eyes fluttered open. As soon as she regained awareness, she met his gaze, questioning his actions. Why had he saved her? Dokja realized she had been awake all along. She had merely pretended to be unconscious, waiting for the perfect moment to strike when her captor's guards were down. He acknowledged her strategy but didn't linger. If that was her plan, then he would leave her to it. However, before he could step away, Suyong stopped him. Her condition was worse than she let on. Her health and mana were depleted, leaving her in no state to fight. She warned him that if he saved her, the constellations watching his channel would turn away. They disliked drawn-out battles and preferred immediate, decisive action. Dokja remained unfazed. There were always constellations with different tastes. Not all of them sought pure brutality. Soo-young smirked despite her condition, recognizing the irony of the situation. It was the classic trope, the hero saving a beauty in distress. She reminded him that he had always disliked cliches. Dokja remained composed as he faced the chaos around him. He was not a hero, nor did he have any intention of acting like one. As a wanderer lunged toward him, he slammed his foot down, stopping the attack instantly. The force sent the attacker crashing to the ground, writhing in pain. Scanning the surroundings, Dokja quickly realized that more wanderers must be gathering from other areas. The situation was escalating, but he remained unfazed. Internally, he considered the effects of his title, King of No Killing. To activate its effects, he needed karma points, which were only granted when the system recognized that he had saved someone. By that logic, if he had chosen to leave Soo-young behind, the system would have deemed her beyond saving. She would have died. With that conclusion, Dokja dismissed any unnecessary hesitation. He turned to Soo-young, making it clear she was no beauty in distress. Soo-young's expression twisted with frustration as she shouted in protest. Before she could argue further, Dokja unceremoniously threw her to the ground. The impact made her yelp in pain, a mixture of shock and irritation flashing across her face. She hadn't meant for it to happen like that, but there was no time for complaints. Dokja had already set the stage for their next move. If Soo-young enjoyed cliches, he had crafted the perfect one for her. She would fight alongside him. Soo-young, though still annoyed, understood the situation. She scoffed at the idea of working together so easily, especially with someone who had been her enemy moments ago. Yet she was pragmatic. There was no choice but to move forward. Grabbing a blade, she prepared herself. This battle would not last long. They would end it swiftly and move on to the next stage. Dokja found her attempt to act cool amusing. It was far too late for that. The battle erupted in full force. Dokja's blade pierced torsos with calculated force, while Soo-young's weapon found its mark from behind, driving through their chests without hesitation. Blood spilled freely as their enemies collapsed one by one. The massacre continued, each kill executed with efficiency. The once lively coin farm was now painted with gore. Their systematic approach left little room for resistance. Slowly but surely, their enemies dwindled. The coin farm had been destroyed. Soo-young, despite her exhaustion, couldn't help but grin. The battle had been ruthless, but the rewards made it worthwhile. The number of coins they had collected was nothing short of impressive. Dokja glanced at the coins they had gathered, calculating the total. He didn't want to split them with Soo-young, but he had to acknowledge that he wouldn't have made it this far without her. Begrudgingly, he decided to think of it as a tip for her contribution. As he stood there, a weak laugh echoed through the bloodied battlefield. Deputy Yun, now sitting on the ground, chuckled through his pain. There was something unsettling about his laughter, a knowing amusement hidden beneath the exhaustion. Dokja's attention sharpened when Yun finally spoke. The words were slow, deliberate, and laced with mockery. Yun had expected this outcome. He had known that Dokja would turn out this way. The rumors had already warned him. The mention of rumors caught Dokja off guard. What rumors? Who had been talking about him? Before he could dwell on it, Soo-young acted. Without hesitation, she brought her blade down in a swift motion. The sharp edge sliced through Deputy Yun's neck in a single clean strike. Blood spurted into the air as his severed head tumbled to the ground. The light in his eyes faded instantly. Soo-young wiped her blade, showing no remorse. She scoffed at the fallen man, dismissing his last words as the ramblings of someone unimportant. To her, he was nothing more than a bit-part actor in a meaningless scene. Turning to Dokja, she noticed the look on his face. Something in his expression had changed. She questioned him, wondering if he felt sadness over the man's death. Dokja denied it, but his silence spoke otherwise. His mind drifted back to old memories, recalling moments from the past with Deputy Yun, a time before all of this, before the bloodshed, before the chaos. But he did not voice those thoughts. They belonged to the past now. Soo-young, unimpressed by his silence, pointed out his mistake. Letting Yun speak for so long had only slowed things down. The constellations didn't appreciate drawn-out conversations. They wanted action, not hesitation. Dokja processed her words. Of course, she wasn't actually concerned about him. Her words had nothing to do with his emotions. She was simply focused on efficiency. He scoffed at the idea, dismissing her claim. She was wrong. The best way to earn coins wasn't by rushing into the kill. It was about balance. Letting the victims speak first. Letting their fear build. That was where the true reward came from. The constellations enjoyed a proper build-up before the final moment. Without frustration, there was no catharsis. Soo-young, ever confident, disagreed. She believed the constellations preferred immediate executions. There was no need for drawn-out endings. Dokja wasn't even an author. What did he know about what the audience wanted? Dokja met her gaze with certainty. He didn't need to be an author to understand. He was a reader, and readers always knew better. Dokja ignored Soo-young and focused on the scattered items around him. Most of it was useless, broken weapons, and scraps of clothing, but among them, he found something worth taking. an old gentleman's suit. It wasn't in perfect condition, but it would serve its purpose. He examined the suit as he put it on. Its defense wasn't particularly high, but it was still better than the robe of the great monk Samyang that he had been wearing. It would provide some level of protection, and right now, that was enough. As soon as he adjusted the suit, a couple of system messages appeared before him. He had saved someone of his own kind, and as a result, his karma points had increased by 1. The system had acknowledged his actions. Around him, murmurs spread among the people who had been saved. They whispered to one another, their voices filled with both awe and uncertainty. Their gazes fixed on him, recognizing him as the man who had fought for them. They wondered if he had truly won. Before they could approach him, Dokja raised his hand, stopping them from speaking. He had done what he could, but from this point on, they were on their own. He couldn't afford to take care of them, not when he had his own path to follow. It may have seemed cruel, but he had no choice. Still, he didn't leave them completely without guidance. He pointed to the items around them, telling them to take what they needed. There were still supplies left, and if they wanted to survive, they should make use of them. He also advised them to head toward Chungmuro, where they might find others who could help. Before he had even finished speaking, the crowd had already started moving. People rushed forward, picking up whatever they could find. Their eyes burned with newfound determination, clinging to hope once more. As Dokja watched them, he finally understood the true reason why the dokkaebi had brought him here. The people who had been victims mere moments ago were now standing against one another, weapons clutched tightly in their hands. What had once been fear had turned into greed, and now they were ready to fight for survival. Their desperation erased the last traces of their humanity. Shouts filled the air as arguments broke out. People accused each other of stealing. They lunged at one another, ready to harm just to claim a better weapon or a slightly more useful item. This was a world without a king, without order, without laws, and without anyone to enforce morality. Everything had collapsed into chaos. The rules that once governed society had become meaningless, and the true nature of humans was being revealed. The dokkaebi had shown him this on purpose. In a world without a ruler, only the strong would dictate the future. Su-young stood before the chaotic crowd, her voice cutting through the madness. She scolded them harshly, questioning whether they had lost their minds. They were acting like wild animals, fighting among themselves when they should be working together. If they truly wanted to survive, they needed to think instead of resorting to violence. Who knew if they would run into another situation like this again? Turning on each other now would only weaken them. The frightened people turned their attention to Su-young, their anger momentarily replaced by uncertainty. She pointed out that they already had enough weapons and supplies. Grabbing a few extra items here wouldn't make them stronger than the real threats they would face. If they truly wanted to survive, they needed to find reliable allies, people they could trust to have their backs. That was just common sense. Dokja listened as she spoke, his eyes narrowing slightly. The words she had just said were familiar. He recognized that line. It wasn't hers. As he opened his mouth to confront her, So-young quickly cut him off. She hastily reinforced her statement, urging the survivors to act properly before abruptly turning on her heels and bolting away. But her stamina was low. She wouldn't get far. Without hesitation, Dokja sprinted after her. She glanced over her shoulder in alarm, demanding to know why he was following her. But Dokja was more focused on the words she had just used. That line, about finding trustworthy allies before becoming undefeatable, wasn't hers. It was from the novel. Jung-hyuk had said those exact words once before, speaking to the survivors who had come to him for guidance. So-young denied it, insisting that the line came from her own novel. But if that were true, then why was she running away? Dokja didn't let up, chasing her down with ease. It was clear she wouldn't admit to plagiarizing the novel, but that didn't matter. He reached out, grabbing her firmly from behind, stopping her in her tracks. He reminded her that he had helped her earlier. That meant she still owed him. So-young let out a startled protest, confused by his words. But Dokja didn't care for her complaints. He got straight to the point. If she had a power bank, he needed it. Frustration flashed across So-young's face as she gritted her teeth. She argued back, claiming that he probably had plenty of his own. So-young pulled out her phone, showing the dimly lit screen. She claimed she had no power banks left. To prove her point, she tilted the phone toward Dokja, revealing that her battery was at 40%. Dokja, however, wasn't interested in the battery. He had another request. He asked to see her novel. So-young immediately refused, her voice firm. If he wanted to read it, he would have to pay for it. Ignoring her protests, Dokja swiftly snatched the phone from her hands. He pointed out the obvious. There was no way to make any payments when all the servers were down. So-young reacted instantly, her frustration turning into action. She lunged toward him, trying to grab her phone back, but her smaller frame worked against her. No matter how hard she stretched her arm, she couldn't reach it. But Dokja wasn't paying attention to her frantic attempts. His focus remained on the contents of the phone. A thought crossed his mind. What if the file she had was like his own, something that could only be read by her? If that were the case, he needed to check. His eyes scanned the text, and immediately familiar words filled his vision. He could read read them. The title stood out first, Triple S Grade Infinite Regressor. As he read further, the story unfolded in front of him. The protagonist, Jung Hyun, quietly turned on his status window, eager to check out a skill he had just obtained. Jung Hyun smiled as he reviewed his status window, feeling triumphant. This round, luck had finally been on his side. Dokja couldn't help but comment. This was plagiarism at its finest. Soyoung, still struggling to get her phone back, protested, but Dokja pointed out the obvious. The character profile was an exact copy of the one from Ways of Survival. She hadn't even bothered to make meaningful changes. Soyoung snapped back, defensive. Dokja pressed further, finding more proof. Even the protagonist's name was a giveaway. There was a typo written as Junghyun. If the original author ever saw this, it would be impossible to deny. The evidence was right in front of them. He even questioned whether she had simply copied and pasted the entire thing. Soyoung gritted her teeth, her frustration reaching its peak. Dokja then pushed forward with a final question. He wanted to know exactly how many episodes she had read from the original novel. Soyoung, caught off guard, answered before she could stop herself. 99. A moment later, realization dawned on her, and she cursed under her breath. Why was she even answering his questions? Dokja processed the new information, so it was Soyoung who had read up to episode 99 of Ways of Survival. A strange thought crossed his mind. What would the original author say if he knew that the person who had read his novel the most, besides Dokja himself, was none other than a plagiarist? Turning his attention back to Soyoung, he tested her knowledge. If she had read that far, she must know about the meteorite. He questioned whether it was something that also appeared in her novel. Soyoung immediately denied it, insisting that there were no meteorites in her story. Dokja, unimpressed, pressed further. He had expected her to copy that too. Frustration flashed across Soyoung's face as she corrected him. While she might not have included a meteorite, her story did feature something called the Sealing Stone. She snapped at him to stop pushing her. That was all Dokja needed to hear, so she really had done it. Soyoung was the one who had discovered the meteorite, the same one that contained the fire dragon he had slain at Anguk Station. The realization settled in his mind. Without hesitation, he stated his next move. He was going to search for the Sealing Stones. Soyoung immediately picked up on his meaning, questioning whether he actually meant meteorites. Dokja brushed off the correction. She understood what he meant, and that was enough. What mattered now was that she had knowledge about them. As this conversation played out, another thought crossed Dokja's mind. He remembered putting up the fire dragon carcasses for auction. Had they been sold yet? The dokkaebis in charge of the Soul Dome must have been in a meeting. That was likely why things had been silent. They were probably discussing how to salvage the situation, perhaps coming to terms with the fact that this edition of the scenario was ruined, so they might as well sell as many coin products as possible. For a moment, Dokja ignored Soyoung and tried to call out to Byung, but there was no response. Then, at that exact moment, the exchange window and dokkaebi bag window popped open at the same time. Dokja scoffed at the timing. Even when Byung was too busy to respond to messages, he still made sure to push advertisements and sales. Curious, Dokja carefully checked the store. What he saw next completely surprised him. Every item he had put up for auction had been sold. Someone had actually purchased them at those prices. Even the bone he had listed, simply because he had nowhere else to store it, had been taken. For a brief moment, he couldn't help but wonder, who in the world had bought them? Dokja glanced at the auction results and let out a sigh. If he had known they would sell this quickly, he should have listed them at 99,999 coins instead. He ran through a mental list of the few incarnations who could afford such a high price. There was Anna Croft, backed by a powerful Nebula. Then there was Ranveer Khan from India, known for his vast resources, and Fei Hu from China, another strong candidate. Beyond them, there were very few who could have made such a purchase. Whoever it was, he silently thanked them. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted by Soyoung, who was watching him closely. She questioned why he wanted her to come along when he was fully capable of handling things on his own. Dokja hesitated for a moment. It was true. Taking Soyoung with him was a gamble. She had already put his life in danger once, and everything she had done so far only confirmed that she was a selfish and opportunistic person. However, there was no denying her usefulness. Her avatar skill had already proven to be a valuable asset, and aside from himself, she was the person who knew the most about Ways of Survival. That knowledge alone made her worth keeping around. Recalling her own words, he reminded her of what she had said earlier, that finding trustworthy allies was the key to survival. He then pulled out an item he had just purchased. A message popped up in his vision, confirming that the temporary pledge item had been used. Unlike a support contract, this wasn't a binding agreement, but it would serve its purpose for now. Soyoung's reaction was immediate and furious. She refused to sign anything, glaring at him as if he had just insulted her pride. Dokja remained calm, stating that he wasn't forcing her to do anything. Her frustration didn't subside. She had never followed orders from anyone in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. Dokja simply responded that there was a first time for everything. everything. Despite her irritation, Soyoung gritted her teeth and agreed, but only under one condition: they would have to share intel. She had many questions for him, and he would have to answer them truthfully. If he lied, she would know, because she possessed the lie detection skill. A notification appeared in Dokja's vision, confirming that Soyoung had activated her skill. She wasted no time and immediately demanded to know what his attribute was. Without hesitation, Dokja replied that he didn't know. Another message appeared, confirming that Soyoung had verified the truth in his words. For the first time, her expression shifted. Shock flickered in her eyes as she realized that he was telling the truth. Soyoung stared at the system message in disbelief. She tapped her temple, her expression turning baffled. It was as if she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. For a moment, she seemed to wonder if her lie detection skill was malfunctioning. Dokja remained calm, explaining that the skill was functioning perfectly. He urged her to continue with her questions, but reminded her that she only had 3 in total, and she had already used one. She hesitated before pressing forward. The next question was one he had anticipated. She demanded to know why he had given up the absolute throne. Dokja had seen this coming. Soyoung's frustration boiled over as she accused him of ruining everything. If it weren't for him, her plans wouldn't have collapsed. She had worked tirelessly to prevent the end of the world, struggling to keep things together while surrounded by fools. If she had taken the throne, they would have already advanced to the next scenario. Everything would have been in motion, exactly as she had intended, but Dokja cut her off before she could continue. If she had taken the throne, Seoul would have already been in ruins. A system notification confirmed that his statement was true. Soyoung froze, her confidence shaken. Her eyes flickered back to the notification, then back to Dokja. She tapped her head again as if trying to make sense of what she had just read. It made no sense. The system was verifying his words. How could that be? She muttered to herself that the skill must be broken. Dokja corrected her again. It was working just fine, and it wasn't just her who would have led things to disaster. No matter who sat on that throne, the result would have been the same. For the first time, Soyoung fell silent. Her mind reeled at what she had just learned. The system wasn't lying. That meant Dokja had spoken the truth. She had always believed that taking the absolute throne would have been the best path forward. But now, she was forced to reconsider everything. Then, her mind snapped to another question. How did Dokja know this? What number renouncer was he? How could he possibly know something even she, with all her knowledge, didn't? Dokja simply answered that he wasn't a renouncer. That answer only unsettled her further. A terrible realization dawned on her, and she asked the final question. Just how much of Ways of Survival had he read? Dokja didn't answer. Instead, he reminded her that she had used up all 3 of her questions. Soyoung's frustration reached its peak. She wasn't ready to let this go. Of all the things he could have refused to answer, this was the most important one. She had to know. Her voice wavered as a dreadful thought took hold. No one could have been mad enough to read all of it. Suddenly, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. Though it wasn't horses, it was heavier, sharper, and more primal. Dokja quickly signaled Soyoung to remain silent. The two of them moved swiftly, slipping behind a nearby building, using the structure's shadow for cover. Something was coming. As they peeked from their hiding spot, the scene before them came into focus. A group of large beings ran down the street. They had human faces but monstrous bodies, covered entirely in fur. Their limbs were muscular and beast-like, and they moved on 2 legs like humans, but were almost twice the size. They resembled wolves in shape, but retained a disturbing trace of humanity. At the front of this group, one figure stood out, larger, more intimidating than the others. Its sharp claws glinted under the light, and its gait was heavier, filled with command. It was clearly the leader. This was a pack of humanoid demons. They were hunting. The leader growled, his voice guttural, asking about the intruders. One of the wanderers, nervous and trembling, tried to explain that the attackers who had destroyed their coin farms were still nearby. But before he could even finish, the monstrous leader slashed the wanderer's chest with one swift, brutal movement. The scene was terrifying. Dokja, still watching from behind the building, understood the meaning behind what he was witnessing. The people known as wanderers had different ways of surviving in this collapsing world. Some tried to hold on to their humanity by farming coins. Others, like those they were seeing now, had given up their human form completely, choosing to become something new, something non-human, just to survive. They must have used the meteorite, a source of transformation. Soyoung's eyes narrowed as she looked at the leader. She recognized him immediately. He was one of the renouncers. That revelation caught Dokja off guard. He asked her how she knew that. Soyoung revealed a part of her ability, something unique to her as the last renouncer. She had the power to see the stats and attributes of all other renouncers. Dokja paused as he remembered something Minsob had once said, that the first disciple had come to find him as soon as the scenario began. It made sense now. Soyoung had a skill that allowed her to detect fellow renouncers. She admitted that she had been suspicious of Dokja at first. Her power hadn't worked on him, even though everything about him screamed that he was one of them. There had been others who refused to join join her cause. Some were forgotten, dead before they could make a mark, but the beast before them had been one of those people, someone who had turned away from her group and now walked a monstrous path. Soo-young hadn't given it much thought at the time, but now, seeing what he had become, she couldn't ignore it anymore. Dokja stared at the massive beast before him, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He demanded to know what this creature used to be. Soo-young answered calmly. His name was Sung Minu. That name struck something deep within Dokja. It wasn't from the novel, and yet, it wasn't unfamiliar. His eyes widened in realization. This wasn't just any wanderer turned beast. Dokja had heard that name before. Sung Minu. The memory came rushing back like a cold wave. Just a few hours ago, he had dreamed of his school days, the painful moments etched into his past. He remembered the classroom, the gang of bullies, and the boy who towered over him with mocking eyes. His name had been printed clearly on the school badge. Sung Minu. It had to be him. That same face, though now distorted and covered in fur, still held the same cruel expression. It was hard to believe, but somehow the same thug from his school years had made it into this world. A person like him, who once laughed at books and bullied others for reading, was now here, transformed, monstrous, and strong. Soo-young studied the beast carefully. She noticed something different about him. Using her unique ability to read the attributes of renouncers, she saw something strange. Sung Minu was a renouncer who had only read up to chapter 173 of the novel. That was unheard of. Most renouncers either read only the beginning or the entire novel, but this one, he had stopped just before it ended. Just then, Sung Minu sniffed the air. His head turned toward the building where Dokja and Soo-young were hiding. His eyes glowed with recognition, wild and focused. The meaning behind his gaze was clear. I found you. With animalistic fury, Sung Minu dropped to all fours and charged straight toward them. Dokja's mind flashed again to the past. He was a teenager in school, clutching his book tightly as a voice called out to him with mockery. A strong hand grabbed his collar, dragging him from his seat while others around them laughed. Sung Minu, the school thug, had always treated him like a joke. That same bully was now in front of him again, but this time wearing the form of a beast. Without hesitation, Sung Minu punched Dokja in the gut, the impact so strong that blood burst from Dokja's mouth. The force of the strike sent waves of pain through his body. Minu, now more monster than man, demanded to know who had destroyed his coin farm. His voice carried rage and accusation. Nearby, Soo-young was already battered and wounded from her earlier encounter with him. She wiped the blood from her mouth and turned to Dokja, shouting for him to fight back. She urged him to kill the beast before them, and then something happened. The moment Soo-young shouted Dokja's name, it triggered something inside Sung Minu. The beast paused. His wild expression flickered for just a second, and a shadow of recognition crossed his face. That name stirred something deep within him. As Dokja was gripped by the monster's hand and dragged forward by the collar, he stared into the beast's eyes. The voice, the expression, it all confirmed one thing. There was no doubt anymore. This creature was Sung Minu, yet confusion filled Dokja's thoughts. How could someone like Sung Minu be a renouncer? It didn't make sense. In the past, he had been the typical jock, the kind who mocked people for reading, who thought novels were a waste of time. There was no way someone like that could have read 3 Ways to Survive the Apocalypse. Still holding him by the collar, Sung Minu leaned closer, examining his face. A memory seemed to spark in his monstrous mind. He began to recall the old days, back when Dokja would quietly read his novel on the phone during school, back when Minu, in his usual arrogant way, had snatched Dokja's phone and scrolled through the story with a sneer. He had laughed, called him a nerd, and ridiculed him for being into something so strange. Now, in the present, that memory returned to the beast's mind. Sung Minu remembered clearly who Dokja was. He claimed to recognize him and voiced it aloud. Dokja denied it, though deep down he knew exactly who this monster used to be. Sung Minu lifted him higher with one arm, showing no effort. The mocking tone from years ago returned in his voice. He found it amusing that someone like Dokja, a weak, quiet kid always lost in a book, had managed to survive this long. He taunted him, reminding him of how he was always reading that strange web novel, as if surprised the loser hadn't already died. Dokja's thoughts raced. Despite the terrifying strength of tier 6 humanoids like Minu, he reminded himself that he had already faced worse. He had defeated a tier 5 fire dragon before. He couldn't let himself be overwhelmed here. Dokja tried to refocus. He reminded himself that he still had the fourth wall skill. That power had protected him before, kept his mind steady when things threatened to break it. But just as he reached for it, the system message appeared before him. The fourth wall was shaking. A strange sensation stirred deep inside Dokja. It wasn't fear, but a realization. Something important was becoming clear. And then it hit him. The problem wasn't Sung Minu's strength. It was something inside him. The fourth wall wasn't acting the way it used to. The memory of that moment when he had entered Young Hee-won's body body in first person flashed across his mind. That was when it had first faltered. He finally understood. The fourth wall wasn't just a protective skill, it was something more. Something that separated him from the story. And right now, that separation was weakening. Sung Minu's monstrous face twisted into something almost curious. His jaws widened unnaturally, and his gaze burned into Dokja with a strange hunger. He asked about the story Dokja used to read, demanding to know where he could find the rest of it. Dokja's heart pounded. Terror surged through him, but his thoughts remained strangely sharp. The fourth wall, that strange personal skill, had been with him since the beginning. He still didn't fully understand everything it could do, but there was one thing he knew without doubt. This skill made him perceive the world around him as fiction. It had always helped him stay calm, detached, like a reader watching the events of a story unfold rather than a participant living them. But that line of safety shattered in an instant. Without warning, Sung Minu struck. Dokja's body was thrown violently across the space. He crashed and dragged along the rough asphalt, skidding until his back slammed into a concrete wall. His vision blurred. The pain was immediate and sharp, and each breath came with a struggle as he lay there, gasping and bloodied. He turned his gaze toward the sky. Dark clouds were gathering overhead, but they looked ordinary, nothing more than signs of incoming rain. And yet, he knew better. This was the omen of the Great Hall. It wasn't just the weather, it was a sign of something bigger. Despite the chaos, Dokja's mind continued to analyze. He could make fast decisions, anticipate outcomes. It was like observing himself from outside, like he was a character being watched through someone else's eyes. It was all because of the fourth wall. It allowed him to survive by making reality feel like fiction. From the distance, So-young's voice broke through the noise. Her voice was filled with frustration and desperation. She reminded him that he had made a promise, that she was relying on him, and yet there he was, motionless, overwhelmed, and buried in thought. So-young was already reaching her limit. Her avatars fought fiercely, trying to contain Sung Minu and the werewolves. Her nose was bleeding, her veins bulging under the immense pressure. She was pushing beyond what her magic could sustain. Every ounce of strength left in her was being used just to hold the situation together. And still, her voice rose again, demanding why Dokja wasn't moving, why he had abandoned her trust. Dokja remained in silence deep within his thoughts. He began to understand what the fourth wall truly meant. In the world of theater, it was the invisible barrier separating the actors from the audience, preventing them from acknowledging one another. His skill worked the same way. It made everything feel distant, like a story unfolding before his eyes. But now, something had changed. The fourth wall was shaking. It was breaking down. That meant only one thing. He was no longer able to separate himself from the reality in front of him. He had begun to recognize Sung Minu not as a fictional character, but as something real, someone from his past, whose presence tore through the illusion. As So-young called out to him again, Dokja responded while walking toward her, offering the excuse that he was powering up, but So-young could barely hear his voice. Her mind was clouded by pain, her focus fractured by battle. But his words echoed through the chaos. He didn't want to win easily. He never had. Victory meant nothing without struggle. That was what made stories powerful. So-young stood beside Dokja, her expression twisted between concern and frustration. She glanced at him, still catching her breath from the earlier battle, and questioned his behavior. She had heard pieces of the earlier exchange between Dokja and Sung Minu. Even though she hadn't meant to eavesdrop, the words had reached her ears. Dokja didn't deny it. He quietly admitted that he knew Sung Minu from the past. That person had left a mark on him, deep and painful. It wasn't just a childhood grudge. It was trauma that had followed him into adulthood, but he brushed it off lightly, as if trying to protect himself by minimizing it. That only frustrated So-young more. She didn't understand how someone could talk about trauma a little. To her, it made no sense. She offered to help. She told him he could lean on her, trying to lighten the moment with the kind of encouragement found in the novels. Those magical words that often gave characters sudden power boosts. But Dokja didn't respond the way a protagonist might. He reminded himself and her that he wasn't Hyun Sung. He wasn't someone who could change just by hearing motivational words. A sharp ache ran through Dokja's body. The place where Minu had struck him hurt more than expected. He realized something important. The fourth wall, usually a shield against pain, was no longer working like before. The detachment it once gave him was fading. He looked straight at the monstrous figure standing ahead. That was not the Sung Minu from high school anymore. That creature was no longer human. It was a beast, a monster shaped in a humanoid form. The boy who once bullied Dokja no longer existed. Dokja reminded himself that he was now 28 years old. He was no longer that timid 17-year-old who had once been broken by fear and humiliation. The fourth wall couldn't be allowed to tremble every time a ghost from his past appeared. He needed to be stronger. As if responding to his resolve, a new scenario suddenly emerged. A bounty scenario had begun. Its title was Overcome Your Trauma. It was a challenge requested by constellations, including one who had faced their own trials too late. The The objective was clear. Dokja had to face his past and defeat it within the time limit. Only then could he rid himself of the shadow that had followed him all these years. Turning to Soo-young, Dokja took charge. She was already bleeding and worn out. He told her to stand back. She had done enough. Soo-young, surprised, looked ready to protest, but the determination in Dokja's eyes silenced her. In that moment, Dokja made a critical decision. He poured a large number of coins into his stats, focusing on strength and agility. The changes were immediate, flowing through his body like fire. Then he drew his weapon, the Blade of Faith. With it, he activated the ether effect and converted its power into holy energy. Light shimmered across the blade. Inwardly, Dokja reassured himself. There was no real reason for him to lose this fight. He had been momentarily shaken because of the fourth wall, but that was over now. The fear was still there, but so was clarity. He had the power, the tools, and the will. He could overpower them. This wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about confronting what he had always run from. It was time to end this. Dokja scanned the battlefield, his gaze locking onto Seungminu. Behind him, Soo-young called out, checking on him. She could sense something had shifted, but Dokja responded with quiet determination. He was ready. Seungminu noticed the shift too. The air around Dokja had changed. It wasn't the same trembling boy from years ago. Dokja closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and exhaled with resolve. Then he opened his eyes, and the fear in them was gone. The time to overcome his past had arrived. Without hesitation, Dokja launched himself forward. His speed was unreal, far beyond what Minu expected. Caught off guard, Minu barely had time to react. Though he increased his agility in defense, it wasn't enough. In one clean motion, Dokja closed the distance and slashed his sword across Minu's chest. The blade tore through flesh, blood sprayed through the air, and Minu staggered back, shocked and wounded. Even as Minu leapt away, barely resisting the force of Dokja's attack, Dokja wasn't finished. He poured more coins into his agility stat. A system message echoed in his vision. A flurry-like swiftness now coursed through his body. Dodging a flurry of razor-sharp claws, Dokja slipped through with barely a graze and retaliated. With deadly precision, he severed Minu's hand in a single strike. The severed arm spun through the air before crashing to the ground. Minu cried out, blood spilling, eyes wide in pain. But the monster's roar came not from defeat, it came from regeneration. His flesh was already stitching itself together. The arm began to regrow. Dokja immediately understood. Minu possessed the physical regeneration ability, a trait exclusive to the werewolves. But this one was faster than usual. Something else was at work here. Perhaps some external protection was aiding him. Yet for Dokja, that was a good thing. After all, the goal of the bounty scenario wasn't to kill the enemy. It was to overcome the trauma he represented. The constellations who were watching wouldn't be entertained if the challenge was too easy. Dokja lowered his blade and shifted tactics. He would face this with his own hands. He poured even more coins into his strength stat. The surge of power rushed through him, but the cost was showing. His exclusive skill, the fourth wall, began to tremble. The protection that shielded his mind was faltering. He clenched his fists tightly. This time he rushed forward with no weapon. His fist connected squarely with Minu's face. The impact echoed, and the werewolf dropped with a heavy thud. It was a devastating punch, filled with all the weight of the years that had passed. Years of silence. Years of fear. Dokja stood over Minu, looking down at the monster who once haunted his youth. Even now, he didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel vengeance. What he wanted, what he expected, was something else. An apology maybe. A sign that the boy who tormented him had once had a conscience. But as he looked down, something changed. The monster's face twisted in Dokja's eyes. It was no longer the snout and fangs of a beast. It was the human face of Seungminu, the very same face from high school, the very same one that laughed when Dokja cried, that sneered when he trembled. Memories surged. Dokja's vision blurred for a second as he saw himself as a teenager again, helpless, small, hiding behind novels to escape the real world. His breath caught, his hands began to tremble. His fist, raised again for another blow, stopped in midair. Fear returned, not the fear of death, but the fear of the past, the fear of being that boy again. The fourth wall quivered harder now. Inside Dokja's mind, a voice echoed. Soo-young had been right. There was no such thing as a small trauma. Even if he was stronger now, even if he had grown more powerful than Seungminu, his fists were still trembling. The fear was buried deep, tangled in memories from years ago. He cursed inwardly, frustrated by how much control the past still had over him. Then, with a sudden surge, Dokja shook off the fear. Fury erupted within him. He lunged forward and began to strike. His fist crashed down again and again, hammering Minu's body with no pause. Each punch drove years of buried pain deeper into the ground. The air filled with the sound of impact, raw, brutal, unstoppable. Minu, desperate and wounded, tried to retaliate with words. He shouted reminders of the past, about how Dokja used to be nothing more than a weak boy lost in fantasy novels. But that version of Dokja was gone. The man standing now had endured more than Minu could imagine. Minu had never changed. He was still stuck in that same immature state, but Dokja had moved on. The werewolf staggered under the relentless assault. Even when Minu started begging for mercy, Dokja didn't stop. Every blow was a release of years of humiliation. Every punch shouted that he would never be that helpless child again. Inside, Dokja knew, no matter how strong he had become, the nightmares of his past still lingered. The 17-year-old Dokja was still trapped in that one painful moment. He knew that no amount of violence would ever erase what happened. He had read so many stories back then to escape reality, but those scars had remained. Minu howled and pleaded. He cried for Dokja to stop. He even apologized, words spilling out in desperation. But Dokja's fist didn't stop because he wanted an apology. That wasn't the point. The apology didn't matter anymore. What was broken back then couldn't be fixed with just a few words. Dokja tightened his fists again. He wasn't doing this for closure. He wasn't doing this to hear sorry, and Minu's apology wasn't meant for him anyway. There were other victims, others who had suffered under Minu's cruelty. The pain he caused wasn't just Dokja's burden. Minu looked confused. He didn't understand, and Dokja paused for a moment. Deep inside, Dokja acknowledged the truth. He knew Minu had been young and foolish back then. It was something done in ignorance, in the recklessness of youth. He understood that now. As an adult, he knew that this violence didn't make sense. He knew he should stop, but a thought struck him. He remembered Junghyuk. What would someone like Junghyuk have done in this moment? Memories from the novel returned to Dokja's mind like a rush of wind. He remembered a scene where Junghyuk had faced something similar. In that memory, Junghyuk stood before the people who had betrayed him. With eyes cold and unwavering, Junghyuk cut them down without hesitation. His sword slashed through flesh and bone again and again. The betrayal in his previous regression had hardened him. He didn't hesitate. He didn't forgive. He simply destroyed. As Dokja stared down at Sung Minu's broken form, something strange happened. He laughed. Minu, confused and battered, looked up at him with fear and disbelief. He couldn't understand why Dokja was laughing, but Dokja's thoughts were somewhere else. He knew exactly what Junghyuk would have done in this situation, and compared to that, he realized he still had a long way to go. He had changed, but not completely. There was still some part of him holding back. In that moment, a message appeared before his eyes. The fourth wall is starting to shake less. Dokja looked at Minu's face again. For the first time, he felt nothing. No rage, no fear, no trembling, just emptiness. It was the kind of peace that came after facing something that used to haunt him. He chuckled quietly to himself. Even now, he still read fantasy novels. That part of him never changed. Bam! With one final punch, Dokja ended it. His fist struck Minu with such force that the air trembled. The impact launched Minu's body across the space. He crashed into the ground, tearing through the asphalt like a thrown weapon. His body skidded across the street, smashing into a nearby building. The sound of impact echoed through the air. A system message filled Dokja's vision. The bounty scenario was over. The clear condition had been met. So-young approached, unable to hide her shock. She commented on the unbelievable sight, how Dokja, an ordinary-looking man, had beaten a werewolf barehanded. Even the other werewolves had fled. They were too afraid to fight someone like him, but Dokja simply replied that Minu wasn't dead yet. He knew. The battle had ended, but the past didn't vanish so easily. In his mind, he noticed something else. The fourth wall was no longer trembling at the sight of Minu. That meant something. The trauma wasn't fully gone, but it had become something he could stand against. Slowly, little by little, he was becoming stronger, not just physically, but mentally too. He had gained tolerance. Then another notification appeared before him. The constellation known as One Who Overcame the Trials a Little Too Late had taken notice of him. That being was now offering Dokja his stigma, a gift born from enduring great hardship. Dokja's eyes widened as he read the message. He had received self-justification, a power that created a mental defense system. From now on, Dokja would be protected from being overwhelmed by trauma, a shield that wrapped around the most fragile parts of his mind. Meanwhile, another constellation, Prisoner of the Golden Headband, was laughing so hard he was rolling on the floor. He found Dokja's growth amusing, perhaps even admirable. Dokja wondered if this skill was even useful. The name sounded like a joke. He questioned if this was truly a gift from a constellation or just another test in disguise. Meanwhile, So-young called out, pointing toward the fallen werewolf. She reminded Dokja that he hadn't finished the job. Dokja turned his gaze to the battered werewolf. For a moment, he considered the situation carefully. carefully. The being in front of him wasn't human anymore. Killing it wouldn't break any scenario rules, and from the way the constellations were watching, they were hoping for blood. Killing the beast would likely please them. He read the waiting system messages. The audience on Baehyung's channel was eager. Dozens of constellations watched with anticipation, hungry for more violence. But Dokja made up his mind. He turned away and chose to let Minwoo live. Soo-young was stunned. She couldn't understand his decision. Letting a dangerous enemy live seemed foolish. She pointed out that the creature must be carrying many coins. But Dokja stayed firm. He didn't care. His decision had been made. Soo-young, after hearing his permission, considered it for herself. She asked if she could kill Minwoo instead. Dokja gave a small shrug. He warned her softly she might regret it. His words confused her, but he didn't say more. He simply left it to her. Without any hesitation, Soo-young acted. She stepped forward and stabbed the beast with cold precision. Her blade pierced deep into Minwoo's body, ending what was left of him. The werewolf's body twitched once, then fell still. A downpour of system notifications burst into Soo-young's vision. She read them quickly at first, then froze. Her eyes widened, and her hands trembled. The messages weren't about coins or rewards. They were warnings. A powerful entity had taken notice. The system declared that the Demon King, the Architect of Discord, had marked her. Because she had delivered the final blow to a tier 6 humanoid demon, Werewolf Minwoo, the Demon King would remember her name, and soon it would send its minions to find her. Soo-young stumbled back in fear. The weight of the consequences hit her all at once. A scream escaped her lips. She was terrified. Nearby, Dokja laughed quietly. He had predicted this outcome. He had known what would happen. That smile on his face said everything. He had warned her. Soo-young kept glaring at Dokja, but he remained calm. Her angry eyes meant nothing to him. It wouldn't change the reality of what had just happened. He had warned her. Now, she was marked by something far beyond her understanding. But Dokja knew this wasn't just about constellations. In the vast star stream, there were entities even more dangerous. Beings who had chosen not to become constellations. These were ancient, powerful figures lurking near planets and watching from the shadows. Among them were the Demon Kings. Just like constellations chose incarnations, Demon Kings sought their own subjects, usually those who had turned into devil-type monsters or humanoid demons. One of these beings, Andras, the Architect of Discord, had taken notice of Soo-young. He was a lower-ranked Demon King among the 72, but still dangerous. His symbol was the wolf, and the curse he placed was no trivial matter. Dokja tried to ease her fear. He remembered a person from the original novel, Han Myung-go, who had been cursed by a much more dangerous Demon King, one known as the God of Wrath and Lust. That man had survived for a while, so perhaps Soo-young would be fine too. Still, he couldn't help but wonder if Myung-go was even alive anymore. Dokja told Soo-young that being cursed by a low-ranked demon king like Andras wasn't the worst outcome. In fact, it could even draw attention from powerful beings of absolute good. Some constellations might be sympathetic and send her extra donations just for surviving the curse, but Soo-young didn't care about the archangels or their sympathy. The constellation she was aiming for didn't get along with the forces of good. Her path was different. That statement surprised Dokja. He realized something important. Soo-young didn't have a supporting constellation yet. For someone so strong, that was unexpected. Most incarnations accepted a sponsor early on, but Soo-young had waited. He knew that delaying the decision was actually smart. Once an incarnation chose a sponsor, it was permanent. Holding off meant she could still draw the attention of even better constellations based on her future actions. But he hadn't imagined someone like her would be willing to take that risk. Soo-young made it clear she hadn't failed to gain a sponsor. She had simply chosen not to accept one. It was her first regression, and she wasn't gonna rush into anything. She wanted to choose carefully. Dokja agreed. She was right to be cautious. But now he was curious. He asked who she was planning to choose. Soo-young's face lit up with a confident smile. She said the constellation had already shown interest in her, and when she revealed the name, Dokja felt a sudden chill. The Abyssal Black Flame Dragon. That name stirred memories. In the original novel, that very constellation had sponsored Kim Nam-woon, the delusional demon. Nam-woon was known for his brutal strength and mad fighting style. Alongside the steel sword, he had been one of the best. Dokja responded casually to Soo-young's bold revelation, pretending to approve. He called it a smart choice. A powerful constellation like the Abyssal Black Flame Dragon was indeed impressive, but his voice betrayed him. It lacked warmth, and Soo-young caught it immediately. She questioned his sincerity, suspicious of the way he spoke, and demanded to know who his own supporting constellation was to make him act so superior. Dokja simply replied that he was jealous, trying to play it off. But the system wasn't fooled. A faint flicker of a notification exposed his lie, and as soon as she realized it, Soo-young charged at him with a burst of frustration, chasing him for his mockery. Later, after the playful chase ended, they continued their journey and finally arrived near the base of the werewolves. The area was unsettling. It surrounded a ruined broadcasting station. The buildings stood clustered close together, forming a narrow, dark forest of concrete and metal. The air was thick with the stench of blood. From within the maze of structures, the cries of people and the howls of beasts echoed. A battle was taking place. As they moved deeper into what seemed like the werewolves' territory, the true horror started to reveal itself. They passed through what appeared to be an area where prisoners had been kept, and as they approached the main residence of the werewolves, a gruesome scene stopped them in their tracks. Severed human thighs hung like meat in a slaughterhouse, swinging from rubber cords. The sight was sickening. Dokja's thoughts turned cold. He knew of a few ways humans could transform into humanoid demons. One of the most horrifying methods was cannibalism. A person would consume human flesh, sometimes unknowingly during desperate times, and this act would slowly corrupt their form and mind. Once the transformation began, these demons would lose their hesitation. Killing other humans became natural to them. The horror stirred something in him, and he looked at Soo-young. It was clear the scene had affected her as well. She was visibly shaken. She had seen many terrible things, but this brutality still pierced through. Dokja mentioned something he had heard from the other prophets. Rumors had spread, claims that Soo-young's goal was to take over the world using the knowledge she had. It was a strange idea, one that mirrored the accusations she had once faced of being a plagiarist, but she denied it. Her true purpose was simpler yet much heavier, to stop the world from falling apart. That was why she had gathered the disciples. That was why she had pushed forward, even when the world turned on her. Still, Dokja couldn't help but bring up the oddity of her followers. Each one seemed shady and oddly dressed, as if they had stepped out of a different story altogether. But Soo-young didn't back down. That was just who they were, and she refused to be judged for it. Suddenly, both of them fell silent. A loud, wet sound erupted ahead of them. It was the unmistakable noise of flesh bursting, followed by more growls and the sound of bones snapping. Their bodies tensed. Sudden gunfire echoed through the ruined cityscape. Dokja was shocked. He had believed the military had long since collapsed, that there were no organized forces left, but someone was still firing, and he knew ordinary guns would be useless against werewolves. Without wasting time, Dokja and Soo-young ran toward the source of the gunshots. As they reached the building, a brutal sight came into view. Countless werewolf corpses lay piled like a hill, each one riddled with bullets. The sheer number of bodies was overwhelming. These creatures hadn't been taken down by luck. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Both Dokja and Soo-young noticed something strange about the wounds. They spoke almost at the same time. The bullets weren't ordinary. They had elemental properties. Holy power infused within them had pierced the werewolves' defenses. It was the kind of firepower that could only come from someone with special knowledge or blessings. In the distance, Dokja saw several armed figures. They held modern rifles, but what stood out more than the weapons was their clothing. They were all dressed in prison uniforms. Soo-young recognized them immediately. She reminded Dokja of what she had said earlier, about a group from Seodamun Penitentiary led by someone who resembled him in spirit. This was that group. That woman was their leader. She acted like a renouncer, someone who rejected the system's temptations. But even Soo-young's analysis skill couldn't find anything in her profile. They were wanderers like her, powerful survivors. And now, after what they had seen, it was clear. They had become the strongest of them all. Dokja was puzzled. If they were so strong, why hadn't they appeared during the battle for the throne? Their absence had gone unnoticed back then, but now their presence was undeniable. As they observed, one woman broke away from the group and started approaching. She wasn't the leader Soo-young mentioned, but her movements were sharp and fearless. Dokja pulled out Unbroken Faith, readying himself, while Soo-young began activating her avatar skill. The woman didn't stop. Her gun moved, but not toward them. She leaned her body back, aiming not at Dokja or Soo-young, but at the mountain of werewolf corpses. Then she opened fire. A burst of gunshots shredded the piled bodies. Something had been hidden beneath them. Slowly, a large glowing object was revealed, 2 meters tall and wide. It was a yellow meteorite. Dokja's eyes locked onto it immediately. This was no ordinary rock. This meteorite was one of the crucial pieces needed to prevent an upcoming disaster. At the same time, it was the source of the werewolves' unnatural power. The woman stood before it for a moment, then turned her gaze to Dokja. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held intent. She asked if he was Dokja. Dokja's mind raced. How did they know his name? He denied it immediately, pretending to be someone else. He introduced himself as Junghyuk Yu and claimed to hate Dokja with a passion. It was a bold lie. Even Soo-young was caught off guard. Her eyes widened as she watched him lie again so smoothly. She whispered to him, half amused and half annoyed, knowing he couldn't resist twisting the truth. But Dokja stayed in character. He told her to send a message to the renowned announcer, the leader of this group. He told her not to interfere, to follow orders. But the woman didn't waver. She calmly told them that they already knew the truth. They knew he was Dokja, and at that moment, a flickering system notification appeared before Dokja's eyes. Soyoung had used her skill to confirm the woman's statement. She was telling the truth. They truly knew who he was. The woman said that their king had decided to entrust the meteorite to him. Dokja was in disbelief. It wasn't just the fact that they knew who he was, but now they were willingly handing over the meteorite, one of the most valuable resources in the scenario. It didn't make sense. The meteorite was essential to stopping one of the catastrophes. Why would they give it away so easily? Still reeling from the shock, Dokja asked who they were. The woman replied with no hesitation. She and her group were subjects of the King of the Wanderers. Dokja tried to piece together the identity of this king. He asked whether the masked person among them was their leader, pointing out the absence of any banner or symbol. But the woman answered calmly. Their king didn't concern herself with such things. She then relayed one final message. The group would take responsibility for handling the catastrophe in the north. Dokja was to deal with the remaining 4. That was all. Before Dokja or Soyoung could react, the woman and her group turned around and began to leave without offering any further explanation. Soyoung was frustrated. She demanded to know what was going on and asked Dokja if he knew the woman. Dokja quietly admitted that he didn't think so, but something felt familiar and he needed to be sure. Activating character profile, he checked the woman's profile. Her name was Yongran Cho. Her supporting constellation was Joseon's top spiritualist. That name jolted Dokja's thoughts. He hadn't known there was an incarnation with Jeonuchi as a sponsor. While Jeonuchi wasn't as powerful as a judge-type constellation, it was still impressive. More so, Yongran Cho had the Enforcer class, a rare and powerful path. If this was the strength of a mere subject, then how strong was their king? Dokja tried to view the character information of the masked king, but the system gave no results. No data appeared. It was as if the king didn't exist within the system's reach. And then it happened. As he looked at the woman in the mask, a sudden and sharp pain pierced through his head. It was instantaneous and overwhelming. His instincts took over, and he turned his gaze away immediately. His heart raced. Something deep within him reacted. The fourth wall shuddered. This reaction was stronger than what he had experienced when facing Sungminu. Despite having the protection of self-rationalization, Dokja didn't dare challenge the presence before him. He couldn't predict how far the power of the stigma would hold if things went wrong. Soyoung noticed the change in him. She asked if he was alright. Dokja brushed it off, but inside his thoughts were in turmoil. What he had felt was more intense than any fear he had experienced before. Only one person in the world had traumatized him so deeply that even the fourth wall quivered at their presence. He hadn't realized it until now. She had survived. She was alive, and she was in Seoul. The group of wanderers began to move in formation. Without hesitation, they turned and marched away from the battlefield. There was something powerful about their silent unity. It wasn't just movement, it was loyalty in motion. Each of them walked with purpose, as if drawn by the will of the one they called their king. Dokja silently watched them go. In his mind, he realized something he had almost forgotten. These people had probably saved the prisoners taken by the werewolves. And as he saw the way they moved together, he was reminded that to be a king, one didn't need a flag or a throne. A true king inspired loyalty just by being who they were. After a moment, Dokja turned his attention to the object they had left behind, the yellow meteorite, the moonstone. That was its true name. It wasn't an ordinary rock. It was once a celestial body that had circled the stars of a different dimension. Just by touching it, he could feel the surging mana flow into his hand. A soft, glowing light shimmered from within the meteorite's surface. It looked exactly as it had been described in the novel he once read. This moonstone held immense power, and that power was the key to countering one of the coming catastrophes. A system message appeared before Dokja's eyes. The moonstone was expressing a mysterious bond with him. He quietly rejected the pull. Accepting it would lead to transformation. He would eventually become a werewolf. He had no intention of accepting that fate, but still, he knew the moonstone had more to offer. Its power wasn't limited to that curse. While Dokja studied the meteorite, Soyoung was busy tending to the injured survivors. She moved among them, offering help, perhaps also working for something more, maybe aiming to gain the attention of the angels. With a demon king hunting her, any divine support was critical. Dokja watched her and thought that this must be her way of securing donations. Eventually, Soyoung called out to him and asked if he had found anything. Dokja gave a vague response, briefly mentioning how useful the avatar skill was. But Soyoung wasn't satisfied. She wanted to know what he wasn't telling her. There was something from earlier that had been bothering her deeply, the encounter with the Wanderers. She questioned the connection between Dokja and the two strange figures who had approached them, especially the mysterious king who hadn't even shown her face. Dokja admitted the truth quietly to himself. He didn't recognize the woman who had spoken to him directly, but the masked leader, the one who who didn't say a word was probably someone he knew. So-young was confused. Dokja had earlier claimed he didn't know the woman. He clarified in his thoughts that he hadn't meant Yongran-cho, the one who delivered the message. The one he meant was their king, the masked leader. That person was no ordinary incarnation. She wasn't a renouncer, at least not in the way others had been. And more than that, Dokja was almost certain she hadn't even read the novel. The revelation left So-young momentarily speechless. The idea that someone else knew the future was already troubling, but the fact that it wasn't because they had read the novel made it even more unsettling. She demanded an explanation, and Dokja, after a brief pause, admitted the truth. He had told her himself. The confession only deepened So-young's confusion. Of all people, he had willingly shared this story? The same story he dismissed as boring and unimportant? She struggled to understand his reasoning, but Dokja's answer was simple. He had needed something to talk about when he was with her, and at that time, nothing else had come to mind. So-young wasn't satisfied. Whether he knew her or not, there was a bigger issue at hand. If someone besides them knew the future, it meant their advantage was no longer unique. The unpredictability of their situation was already dangerous, but now it was growing even worse. Dokja, however, had already shifted his focus to something else. The Moonstone was the priority. The Wanderers had left it in his care, and he intended to awaken it. At that, So-young's expression hardened. Awaken it? Was he seriously trying to awaken the catastrophe itself? Dokja corrected her misunderstanding. He wasn't awakening the catastrophe, he was preparing the meteorite. By infusing it with mana, they could use its power against the coming disaster. He estimated the process would take 10 hours in total, 4 hours from him and 6 from her. So-young immediately protested. Why was she the one who had to put in 6 hours? Dokja looked at her knowingly and pointed out the obvious. Her mana level was higher than his, wasn't it? He needed her to be honest. How high was her mana stat? There was a pause before she reluctantly gave him an answer. Level 55. Dokja nearly lost his composure. He had assumed it would be high, at least 40, considering the number of avatars she had summoned. But 55. That meant she had spent nearly all of her coins on mana, rather than stamina or strength. Realizing this, Dokja quickly adjusted their plan. He would only infuse the meteorite for 2 hours, while So-young would handle the remaining 8. She immediately objected, calling it unfair. Besides, she was already running low on mana. Dokja had anticipated this as well. Without hesitation, he handed her several mana recovery potions, premium grade items from the dokkaebi shop. So-young eyed the bottles warily. If he could afford items of this quality, then his supporting constellation must be incredibly generous. Was it really okay for her to take them? She even joked about whether or not he had drugged them. Dokja simply stated that he had paid for them himself. So-young hesitated, doubt creeping into her thoughts as she considered the consequences of what they were about to do. The main scenario hadn't even begun yet, and she couldn't shake the fear that tampering with the meteorite might trigger another plausibility warning. The system had already punished them once for stepping out of line. What if it happened again? But Dokja showed no hesitation. His gaze remained fixed on the glowing stone before them as he reassured her that this was different. This wasn't a catastrophe. It was something else entirely. She wasn't convinced. If not a catastrophe, then what? What exactly was buried inside that stone? Dokja's expression held a trace of amusement, as if he were disappointed that she hadn't figured it out herself. He reminded her of the novel's contents, a subtle reprimand that she must have slacked off while plagiarizing. The answer was right there. Had she truly forgotten? Before she could respond, he placed his hand on the moonstone, and the moment his mana surged into it, a violent reaction erupted. Sparks scattered across the surface as the stone trembled beneath his touch, a faint hum growing louder with each passing second. The energy within resisted his intrusion, like something struggling to remain sealed away. Dokja glanced toward her, his voice steady as he asked if she had truly forgotten what would emerge from this meteorite once the scenario began. Realization struck like a bolt of lightning. Fumbling for her phone, So-young quickly scrolled through the novel, her eyes scanning the text with growing urgency. The details were right there, written long before either of them had set foot in this scenario. The moment she found it, her breath caught in her throat. Her grip on the device tightened. This wasn't just a meteorite. It was far more significant than she had assumed. Dokja remained focused, his mana flowing continuously into the stone. Minutes stretched into hours, the strain of maintaining the process gradually taking its toll on his body. The cracks on the meteorite deepened, thin lines of light escaping from within as the pressure inside increased. But knowing that overexerting himself now would only weaken him later, he finally withdrew his hand and leaned back against the rough ground, closing his eyes for just a moment of rest. Time passed. 10 hours had gone by, and the mana potions they had brought were nearly gone. The air around them felt heavier, an almost suffocating presence filling the space. Then, a sudden cry shattered the silence. So-young's voice was laced with urgency as she called out to him, her tone rising in anticipation. The ground beneath them trembled violently. Cracks spread rapidly across the meteorite's surface, glowing fissures illuminating the darkness of of the night. The energy sealed within was reaching its limit. Dokja's eyes snapped open just as the stone gave its final shudder. The moment had arrived. A brilliant light burst forth, pushing back the shadows as the stone finally broke apart. It wasn't the chaotic destruction of a rampaging monster's birth, nor the violent eruption of a disaster waiting to be unleashed, but it was something equally as dangerous. The shattered fragments of the moonstone fell away, revealing the presence hidden within. Then, as if to confirm its significance, a notification flashed before Dokja's eyes. His understanding of this existence had triggered the acquisition of a new skill, Otherworld Interpreter. His comprehension of foreign entities had increased, a result of the effects of the protection symbol of Imyuntar. The silence that followed was shattered by a voice. The words were fragmented, a language not meant for human tongues, but the meaning became clear in Dokja's mind. This was not just any creature, it was one of the ruling species of Kronos, a world where the night granted transformation, drawing power from the moonstone itself. Warriors of the wind, known for their monstrous strength and boundless stamina, and among them, this being was the very first, Imyuntar. As the dust settled, the wolf-like figure stood tall, its piercing gaze sweeping over the two humans before it. With a deep, commanding voice, it introduced itself. It was one of the 5 ruling species of Kronos, a being of great power, the first wolf. Dokja's mind raced as he opened his character profile to confirm what he already suspected. The being before him had a name, Lycaon Isparang. He was 371 years old and bore the support of a powerful constellation, shadow of a destroyed world. Recognition struck immediately. The 5th scenario would bring 5 catastrophes, each capable of ending everything, but there were also 5 beings meant to guide challengers, lending them the strength to fight back, and standing before him now was one of those guides, Lycaon. The awakened warrior turned his gaze toward them, his expression unreadable. There was no hostility, only acknowledgement. He understood what had happened here. With a slow nod, he accepted the situation and welcomed them. The tutorial had ended. They had now entered the real battle. Dokja, however, inwardly scoffed at the idea. Tutorial? There was no such thing. Every scenario mattered. Every battle could be their last. There was no safety net, no grace period, only survival. Lycaon, however, continued speaking with a solemn tone. He addressed them as warriors standing on the edge of destruction, offering his condolences for the catastrophe that had come to their world. But he did not speak only of despair. He was here to help. He was their guide, the one who would train them for what lay ahead. He would teach them everything they needed to know. Then his gaze sharpened, scanning the area as if searching for something or someone. A realization struck him, and his expression shifted. Something was wrong. His voice carried a note of confusion as he questioned them. Had they truly been the only ones to awaken him? Suyong quickly searched her phone, scrolling through the translation for Otherworld Interpretation, hoping to better understand his words. But Dokja already knew the answer. There was no need to hesitate. They were alone. Lycaon found this strange. By now, all 5 guides should have hatched together in the same location. That was how it was meant to be, but something had changed. His voice grew more serious as he asked about the owner of the ruler's throne, the one who should have claimed command over the guides. Dokja understood what he meant. Originally, Lycaon and the other guides were meant to gather at the throne once someone had taken it, but that hadn't happened. The truth was simple. No one had claimed the throne. Lycaon narrowed his eyes, trying to piece it together. If there was no king, then had their ruler been killed? That shouldn't be possible. At this stage, there should be no one powerful enough to defeat the one meant to sit upon the ruler's throne. Dokja's answer was direct. No one had taken the throne to begin with. He refused to believe it. There was no way the throne could have been ignored. It was meant to be claimed, not discarded. His sharp claws twitched as his frustration grew, his entire being rejecting the mere idea that such a thing could have happened. But Dokja, standing firm beneath the beast's towering presence, showed no hesitation. He had expected this reaction. His expression remained calm as he confirmed what Lycaon dreaded to accept. The throne had not only been ignored, it had been destroyed. The words sent a tremor through the air. His mind raced, piecing together the implications, and his voice, now laced with suspicion, pressed for confirmation. Had they really? Dokja's answer came without hesitation. Yes. A snarl tore from Lycaon's throat, his frustration now impossible to contain. His powerful fist clenched, his jaw tightening as a deep, guttural growl echoed through the space. How could they have done such a reckless thing? The sheer stupidity of it made his blood boil. His world had followed the path laid before it, obeying the will of the scenarios, and yet these humans had dared to break the cycle. Meanwhile, Suyong, who had been quietly observing, decided it was time to act. With a quick motion, she purchased just the otherworld interpreter, her mind already calculating the significance of this confrontation. She had little patience for Lycaon's outrage, her gaze flickering with mild amusement at his reaction. Lycaon's massive frame shook, his mind struggling to grasp what this meant for the world before him. His voice dropped into something near despair, the fury replaced by sheer disbelief. If no one held the favor of the great god, then this world, this entire world, was already doomed. His scorn returned in full force as he turned his piercing gaze upon the humans before him. They were fools, no smarter than kobolds, blindly walking toward their own destruction. Did they even understand what they had done? Yet, in the face of his condemnation, Dokja remained still. His mind was clear, unaffected by the wolf's scorn. This reaction, this blind loyalty to the system, was exactly what he had anticipated. These so-called guides, these beings who had come from other worlds, pretended to be their saviors. They claimed to have arrived with knowledge and strength, offering power to those willing to follow them. But beneath their words lay an ulterior motive, something they never openly acknowledged. Stepping forward, Dokja met Lycaon's gaze without hesitation. His voice carried certainty, each word deliberate as he spoke. The prince of the Imyuntar, the once proud ruler of Kronos, was acting as if all hope was lost. But it was too early to surrender. Lycaon's reaction was immediate. Foolish. A mere human dared to lecture him. Did they not understand the weight of what had just transpired? His voice carried the full force of his authority as he scoffed, reminding them that the Imyuntar were a great species, deserving of respect. These creatures had no right to speak as if they knew the burden he carried. But Dokja did not back down. His voice, steady and unrelenting, cut through the thick tension. Had Lycaon too lost his senses when his own home was destroyed? Dokja pressed on, his words relentless. The Imyuntar had ruled Kronos once, standing above all others, but that meant nothing now. This was not Kronos. This was Earth, and just as Earth now faced destruction, Kronos had already fallen. The 5 catastrophes had come, and not even the Imyuntar had been able to stop them. Lycaon's breathing grew heavier. His mind fought against the truth that he had long buried. Then, Dokja spoke the words that shattered any lingering denial. The southern part of Kronos, the land Lycaon had once ruled with pride, had not fallen by mere chance. It had been destroyed, reduced to ash by a force far greater than anything his people could withstand. Ignir, the fire dragon, a being of unrelenting flames and destruction, had descended upon their world. Lycaon bared his fangs. He declared that Dokja and his companions were underestimating the danger ahead. In his eyes, they were foolish mortals standing on the edge of annihilation. He believed they would soon suffer, their bodies consumed by fire, their screams lost in the flames of hell. But Dokja didn't flinch. He made it clear that Ignir would never arrive in their world. The destruction Lycaon spoke of had already been prevented. The fire would not come because the one meant to bring it had already been slain. Lycaon, caught off guard, fell silent. The fury in his eyes faded into something else. He tried to dismiss it with laughter, claiming it was the most ridiculous joke he had ever heard. Dokja reached into his coat and pulled out a blue-colored medallion. It shimmered faintly under the broken sky. At that moment, the mockery in Lycaon's expression vanished. His body stiffened. His gaze locked onto the object in Dokja's hand. It was no ordinary trinket. It was the protection symbol of the Imyuntar, a sacred item known only to the bloodlines tied to dragons and fire. Lycaon staggered back, eyes wide. The very existence of that symbol in the hands of a human meant only one thing. Dokja had faced the fire dragon and survived. The impossible had already happened. Dokja had earned the symbol after defeating the fire dragon at Anguk Station. The battle had almost cost him his life, but in the end he had emerged victorious. With the token now displayed, there was no doubt about his claim. He stood not just as a survivor, but as one acknowledged by the ancient bloodlines. Lycaon, once a proud warrior of the Imyuntar, felt his pride collapse beneath the weight of that symbol. His legs bent unwillingly, his knees hitting the ground. His head followed, lowering in deep respect. The arrogance and rage from earlier had melted into solemn reverence. An hour later, Dokja took the time to explain the situation to Su-young, who had struggled to follow the earlier conversation. She listened carefully, but remained skeptical. The idea that the fire dragon he had killed counted as one of the 5 great catastrophes didn't make sense to her. It was a lesser dragon, not even the true threat. If that was the case, then wouldn't that mean they only had to face 4 catastrophes in the 5th scenario instead of 5? The logic felt strange, almost as if it were a convenient twist in ways of survival. Dokja, however, understood it differently. Anything that hatched from the meteorites counted as a catastrophe. The fire dragon had emerged in place of Ignir, meaning the greater disaster would no longer appear in this scenario. It was a loophole in the system, one that worked in their favor. Still, Soo-young found it odd. Ignir wasn't even in the original novel. It had been one of its offspring instead. If something that strong had shown up so early in the scenario, how would they have even been able to stop it? The balance of power didn't add up. She narrowed her eyes at Dokja, teasing him. His words sounded almost as if he was defending the story's logic. Was he secretly the author of Ways of Survival? He seemed too familiar with how these twists worked. Her gaze then fell on the blue medallion in his hands, the protection symbol he had obtained after killing the fire dragon. If this was the kind of reward they could get from a catastrophe, then maybe the rest weren't as terrifying as they seemed. If even Dokja could kill one, perhaps they didn't need to be so afraid. Dokja, however, wasn't as optimistic. He had only survived the fire dragon by luck. The remaining catastrophes would be just as fearsome as they had been in the novel. Their true challenge was yet to come. So-young let out a breath. If that was the case, what was their next move? Dokja's answer was simple. They would use what they had. Just then, Likaeon struck the wreckage of a nearby car, crushing it effortlessly with a single hand. His strength was undeniable. Soo-young raised an eyebrow, watching him. He certainly looked powerful, but was he really going to fight for them? Dokja shook his head. Guides like Likaeon couldn't fight against the catastrophes of worlds they didn't belong to. More than that, he was a coward at heart. But Likaeon stepped forward, lowering his head with unwavering loyalty. He was ready. He would follow Dokja's command. Dokja, however, felt uneasy. The way Likaeon addressed him was strange. He hesitated before speaking again, asking if he could be called something else. Being referred to as master didn't sit well with him, but Likaeon refused. To him, speaking the name of the one who held the symbol of protection was an honor he could not dare to take. Without hesitation, he prepared to pass down a skill that had been handed through generations of his family, the Way of the Wind. The Way of the Wind was a hidden skill, one that allowed its user to wield the wind as if it were an extension of their own body. It was a technique passed down through the generations of the Immuntar, an ability that could shape the course of battle itself. Dokja reflected on what he knew from Ways of Survival. The 5 great catastrophes emerged in specific locations: north, east, south, west, and the center of Seoul. But with the fire dragon, the catastrophe of the south, already eliminated, the first disaster to appear in the 5th scenario would be the catastrophe of the east. It was the reason he had made the decision to hatch Likaeon in the first place. This skill, the Way of the Wind, was essential in stopping what was coming next. Likaeon stood before him, his stance firm as he prepared to demonstrate. With precision, he moved his hands, explaining the essence of the technique. The tempest belonged in the left hand and the storm in the right. The Way of the Wind would manifest where the straight and the curved met. Dokja, having read the novel, understood what he was seeing. At least he thought he did. He attempted to mimic Likaeon's movements, trying to grasp the flow of the technique. But no matter how hard he tried, something wasn't clicking. Time passed. The training stretched on for another hour. Dokja struggled to control the wind, his efforts falling short again and again. Eventually, Likaeon stopped, hesitating before speaking. There was regret in his voice as he delivered his judgment. Dokja simply wasn't suited for the Way of the Wind. In fact, he didn't seem to have the talent to learn any skill at all. The words cut deep. Dokja fell into deep thought. This skill was critical. Without it, stopping the catastrophe of the East would be nearly impossible. If he couldn't find a way to master it, then he might be responsible for the end of the world. From a distance, So-young burst into laughter at the sight of his failure. Dokja turned back to Likaeon, demanding an explanation. Why? Why was he failing? So-young didn't hold back her amusement. Dokja had already been struggling with this for 2 days. Wasn't it time to admit defeat? After all, Jung-hyuk had mastered the skill in just 5 minutes. Dokja was stunned. It couldn't be. So-young smirked. Had he been fooling himself into thinking he was the protagonist all this time? Just because he had done well so far didn't mean he was Jung-hyuk. Dokja clenched his jaw, his pride wounded. Even so, he understood the theory behind the technique. Likaeon sighed. Understanding something was easy. Actually executing it was an entirely different matter. Dokja focused once more, recalling Likaeon's words. The tempest in the left hand, the storm in the right. The Way of the Wind would open where the straight and the curved met. Likaeon's expression shifted in shock. Somehow Dokja truly did understand the concept, but knowing the theory wasn't enough. Dokja still had no idea how to put it into practice. Likaeon hesitated again, confused by Dokja's frustration. Hadn't he just explained it perfectly? Even Lycan himself couldn't have described it better. Dokja exhaled, shaking his head. No, it was just a metaphor, and that was the problem. But inside his mind, Dokja was losing control. This was driving him crazy. All the instructions and ways of survival were written in the same confusing, cryptic style. None of it ever made direct sense. It was like trying to catch the wind with bare hands. He screamed inwardly, desperate to understand. How was he supposed to do it? In frustration, Dokja tried a new approach. He spoke calmly, but there was an edge in his voice. He suggested an interpretation. When one wind met another, they formed Taegyuk, and when the winds met again, they formed yin and yang. Lycaon was stunned. The wolf-like being looked at Dokja with awe. He couldn't understand how someone could interpret something so deeply and so correctly. But Dokja had no patience left. He demanded Lycaon to stop being amazed and just show the demonstration. Lycaon focused. Around him, winds from opposing directions began to gather. They clashed gently at first, then started to swirl together. The combination of forces brought both heat and cold into the air. The two winds created balance, just like the principle of Taegyuk. Then they separated and rejoined again, forming the concept of yin and yang. Seeing it come alive in front of him, Dokja felt his pride take another blow. It felt impossible. He had come up with the words, but Lycaon was the one turning them into action. From behind, Suyong's laughter erupted again. It echoed across the training area as she held her stomach, laughing wildly at Dokja's failure. Dokja's frustration grew even more. He wasn't ready to admit defeat. He raised his voice again, trying another explanation. What if four winds met together to form a defensive wall? What if they clashed again and shaped a trigram, a pattern so complex that wind could exist everywhere and nowhere at once? That's exactly what he felt like. Confused, surrounded, lost. He pointed out that even Lycaon wouldn't be able to do that, and yet that was the sensation inside Dokja's heart. But instead of mocking him, Lycaon suddenly bowed his head. With sincerity and respect, he thanked Dokja, not just casually, but from the bottom of his heart. At that moment, Lycaon brought his hands together, and something changed in the atmosphere. A surge of energy filled the air. Then, a flurry of system notifications appeared in front of Dokja's eyes. The messages told him that the 5th grade otherworld species, Prince Lycaon of the Immuntar, had received great enlightenment. The Prince of the Immuntar was now truly grateful to him. Suyong laughed even harder now. She had tears in her eyes and held her belly, completely entertained by what had just happened. Dokja could feel his frustration rising all over again, and just then, the sky above cracked with sound. Someone was arriving. Floating in the sky, a familiar figure appeared, transparent yet radiating power. The dokkaebi Bihyung had returned. Dokja activated the dokkaebi communication without delay. Dokja glanced up at him, relieved to see the dokkaebi return. The earlier incident with the mid-level dokkaebi had left him wondering about Bihyung's condition, but Bihyung reassured him he was fine now. That mid-level dokkaebi had been punished and wouldn't be showing up again until the official start of the 5th scenario. What surprised Dokja more was Bihyung's announcement. The channel had leveled up again. Thanks to Dokja's performance, Bihyung was already being considered for a promotion. By the next month, he would likely become a mid-level dokkaebi himself. Dokja acknowledged this, but his voice lacked energy. Bihyung noticed right away. He reminded Dokja that his success would benefit them both. If Bihyung advanced, Dokja would gain better rewards and more attention. But Dokja was thinking ahead. With Bihyung becoming a mid-level dokkaebi, he would probably be much busier. Possibly too busy to pay attention to one incarnation. Bihyung quickly dismissed that concern. He made it clear he didn't care about most other incarnations. But Dokja was different. There was no way he would abandon the person bringing in the highest ratings. As their short exchange ended, Suyong approached. She had been watching silently from a distance. Her usual attitude returned as she asked Dokja what the plan was now. Dokja hesitated. The frustration of failing to learn the way of the wind still lingered in his chest. He admitted that he didn't know what to do yet. He needed to think. Then Suyong offered an idea. She pointed out that the important thing wasn't who learned the way of the wind. It was that someone learned it. If the skill was that vital to stopping the upcoming catastrophe, why not have someone else do it? But Dokja immediately rejected that thought. Only someone bearing the protection symbol could learn the way of the wind. It was a rule built into the scenario itself. The ownership of that symbol wasn't transferable. Even if Suyong was willing, the system wouldn't allow it. Suyong didn't seem to care. Her next suggestion was bolder. If Dokja couldn't learn it, then they should just leave it to Junghyuk. She reasoned that there was still time. They could try to find Junghyuk. If they found him, they could help him grow stronger and survive the scenario. That would make things easier for everyone. But Dokja shook his head. He knew better. Junghyuk didn't listen to others. Suyong, with her usual confidence, claimed she would simply seduce Junghyuk to get him to cooperate. Dokja stared at her for a moment, then looked away. A sarcastic thought crossed his mind. Junghyuk wasn't exactly into children. children. The idea was so absurd it almost made him scoff. Dokja thought to himself, even Junghyuk wouldn't be able to learn the Way of the Wind skill without the protection symbol. That meant Junghyuk would have to take it from him, and the only way to do that was if Dokja died. A heavy truth pressed down on him. After everything he had done to Junghyuk earlier, there was no doubt. If Junghyuk saw him now, he would definitely try to kill him. Dokja opened his mouth to speak, trying to explain his thoughts, but before he could finish, a loud cry broke through the air. Someone was begging for help, shouting that a man was severely injured. Suddenly, several notifications appeared before Dokja's eyes. One of them said that the constellation Demonic Judge of Fire was looking forward to his camaraderie. Others followed. Various constellations were watching and hoped he would offer help to the wounded. Dokja was confused. The constellations were getting unusually involved, pressuring him as if something big was about to happen. Without hesitation, Dokja and Soo-young sprinted toward the voice. As they arrived, Dokja froze in shock. His eyes widened. The situation was far more serious than he expected. There, covered in blood and barely conscious, was Junghyuk, the protagonist, wounded, collapsed, and completely vulnerable. As Dokja stepped closer, he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Floating nearby was Baehyung, smirking with amusement. Dokja instantly grew suspicious. He glared at the dokkaebi, already suspecting he had something to do with this setup. But Baehyung only laughed, pretending to be clueless, as if he knew nothing at all. But the timing felt too perfect. Dokja's instincts told him that this was no coincidence. It seemed likely that Baehyung had secretly activated a sub-scenario to bring Junghyuk here in this condition. Everything pointed to manipulation behind the scenes. Soo-young took a moment to process the situation. They had found Junghyuk, but now came the real challenge. What were they supposed to do? They all knew Junghyuk was the main character. His role was too important to ignore. Saving him felt like the only option. But for Dokja, that decision came with a cost. If he helped Junghyuk, his own life would be at risk. After all, Junghyuk still saw him as an enemy. Soo-young seemed hesitant as she stared at the unconscious figure. She asked if there was any way to restrain him, but Dokja knew the truth. Nothing could hold Junghyuk for long. If they tried to trap him somewhere, he'd simply take his own life to escape. Soo-young thought for a moment, if Junghyuk really died, then he could just regress and return to the past. But what would happen to the others if that happened? That uncertainty lingered in the air. Dokja realized the danger. If Junghyuk regressed now, no one could say for sure what kind of chaos it might bring. Everything could reset, or worse. That's why they had to stop him from dying again. The risk was too great. As Dokja looked down at Junghyuk's bloodied body, his thoughts grew heavier. He tried to guess who could have done this to the protagonist. Judging by the wounds, it looked like Junghyuk had taken a devastating hit, something massive that brought him down in one blow. That level of power, Dokja couldn't help but wonder. Was it him? Could he have been the one who injured him so badly? Soo-young noticed the troubled look on Dokja's face. She asked if something was wrong. Dokja brushed it off, but he was sure. If Junghyuk regained consciousness, he wouldn't let this go. The last time they clashed, Dokja had landed a punch with full force, using 100 points of strength. It had only been 2 days since then. Then suddenly Junghyuk's eyes shot wide open. Blood lined his gaze as he locked eyes with Dokja. His lips were moving, trying to say something. Dokja and Soo-young instinctively stepped back. Their hearts pounded with fear. The pressure in the air shifted, heavy with Junghyuk's killing intent. Dokja felt nervous. He thought to himself that it had been a fair fight back then. Junghyuk had tried to kill him too. Couldn't they just call it even? But the truth was frustrating. Why did the main character of 3 Ways to Survive the Apocalypse have to be someone like Junghyuk? Violent, merciless, and unpredictable? Dokja wondered how different things would have been if someone like Hyunsung or Hee-won had been the protagonist instead. That would have made things easier. Meanwhile, Junghyuk continued to mumble. He was definitely trying to say something, but his voice was too weak. Feeling unsure, Dokja activated his skill, Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint. In that moment, he clearly heard Junghyuk's voice inside his mind. Dokja froze. Junghyuk had spoken his name, not out loud, but directly through thoughts. Junghyuk continued speaking in thought. He said he knew Dokja was listening, and that when he looked back at everything Dokja had done, his voice trailed off with frustration. Then he muttered that maybe he had been wrong. As if his strength finally gave out, Junghyuk's eyes slowly shut again. Dokja panicked and called out to him. He questioned if Junghyuk could still hear him, or if he had fainted again. Something felt off. With wounds this serious, Junghyuk's resuscitation skill should have activated by now. Hurrying, Dokja opened Junghyuk's character profile. What he found left him stunned. The profile showed a status ailment. Something powerful was keeping Junghyuk from healing properly. The symptoms, the way Junghyuk wasn't healing. There was only one explanation. Dokja realized that he must have been poisoned. Poison had always been one of Junghyuk's few weaknesses during the early rounds of his regressions. Before Dokja could process further, a voice called out from nearby. One of the wanderers stepped forward, a nervous look on his face. face. He asked if he was really Dokja. According to him, Jung-hyuk had kept repeating Dokja's name and insisted on being brought to him. Even in such a critical state, Jung-hyuk had made sure someone would deliver him to Dokja. So-young, still confused and alarmed, demanded to know what was going on. Nothing made sense to her anymore. At that moment, the small figure of the dokkaebi reappeared in the air, grinning smugly. He reminded them that he had nothing to do with any of this. It wasn't his doing, and he clearly enjoyed the drama unfolding. Dokja ignored him. He had no time to argue. Instead, he asked the dokkaebi to open the shop. Without hesitation, the interface opened before him, and he quickly began scanning the text descriptions of several items. After reviewing the ingredients, he started purchasing them one by one. Each of these ingredients had its own effect, but Dokja knew exactly what he needed them for. He remembered something important. If the poison involved was Thousand Spirit poison, then Elaine Forest essence alone wouldn't be enough. The poison was far too deadly for a simple cure. As Dokja worked quickly, So-young watched him with curiosity. She asked what he was making, and Dokja answered with determination. He was crafting an antidote. There was no time to hesitate anymore. So-young's expression shifted. She questioned whether he had truly decided to help Jung-hyuk now, despite everything that happened. Dokja, still focused, admitted something strange. He believed that Jung-hyuk had come to him on purpose. Even in his poisoned and dying state, Jung-hyuk had made his way here to him. So-young wasn't sure. She asked why he believed that. Maybe Jung-hyuk had come seeking help, not revenge. There was no way he could have traveled in that condition just to kill someone. Dokja didn't give a full explanation. He simply said that he knew Jung-hyuk, and that was enough. He had spent years reading the novel. He had seen the many lives Jung-hyuk had lived and the choices he made. He knew the kind of person Jung-hyuk truly was, even if Jung-hyuk himself didn't realize it. The flames under the small stove flickered as Dokja adjusted the heat. The contents in the pot started to bubble and boil. The smell wasn't pleasant. The soup looked more like something made by goblins from Death Valley than actual medicine. Still, appearances were misleading. Despite the awful look, the mixture was one of the most effective antidotes for high-grade poisons. Dokja finished the preparation, picked up the soup carefully, and approached Jung-hyuk's motionless body. Time was short. Every second counted. So-young watched this strange act of care unfold before her. She shook her head in disbelief, muttering under her breath how the two of them looked like a perfect couple. He briefly turned to So-young and asked if she wanted to be the one to do it. She immediately refused. Even if she had agreed, Dokja had already made up his mind. He wouldn't let anyone else do it. This responsibility was his alone. As soon as Dokja fed the antidote to Jung-hyuk, a sudden flood of system notifications lit up in his vision. Messages from various constellations began to appear one after another. They praised his act of kindness and sent him a generous amount of coins as a reward. Dokja was surprised. He hadn't expected that feeding someone an antidote would make him that much money. Jung-hyuk let out a faint groan. Slowly, his eyes opened. Though still weak and wounded, the color was starting to return to his face. The antidote was working. The poison inside him was being pushed back. Dokja welcomed him back quietly. Then, without wasting time, he pulled out a special item from his inventory. Midday Rendezvous. This item allowed two people to have a private conversation, isolated from the world, for a limited amount of time. Dokja had several reasons for using it now. First, because Jung-hyuk's tongue was likely still paralyzed from the poison, and he wouldn't be able to speak properly. Second, because Dokja didn't want So-young to overhear anything that might be said. And finally, he didn't want Jung-hyuk to know that he could read minds. If Dokja had more coins, he would have learned the telepathy skill instead. But this item would have to do for now. He sent a message request to Jung-hyuk. A small message window appeared, signaling that the invitation had been delivered. After a few tense seconds, Jung-hyuk accepted. Through the chat, Dokja reached out and asked if Jung-hyuk could hear him. The reply was immediate and commanding. Jung-hyuk told him to head east right away. Dokja clenched his jaw in irritation. Even after being poisoned and nearly dying, Jung-hyuk was still giving orders. He had just saved his life, yet here he was, acting like nothing had changed. Then came a warning. Jung-hyuk informed him that something dangerous was about to awaken. The catastrophe of questions. Dokja froze. The name alone sent a chill down his spine. It was a major event from the novel, and it was happening now. Jung-hyuk added one more crucial detail. Someone was awakening all of the catastrophes. Those words struck deep. This wasn't just a random accident. Something or someone was deliberately pushing the world toward chaos. After some time, Dokja and So-young left behind Likayan, who was still sitting quietly in his place, deep in the process of gaining enlightenment. The wolf had yet to wake up, but Dokja wasn't too worried. Instead, he focused on carrying Jung-hyuk on his back, dashing toward their next destination. While running, So-young asked if it was really okay to leave Likayan behind like that, but Dokja explained calmly that Likayan, as an Immuntar, could sense the presence of symbol owners. Once he regained consciousness, he would come to find them on his own. That that wasn't the real issue. What bothered Dokja more was why Soo-young couldn't help carry Jung-hyuk. After all, she had the power of her avatar, but Soo-young refused immediately. Her reason was sharp. She couldn't bring herself to carry the man who had once decapitated her. It was something Dokja couldn't really argue with. Then from Dokja's back, Jung-hyuk's weak voice spoke up. He said they could leave him there. He didn't need their help. Dokja was already exhausted and snapped back, warning that if Jung-hyuk kept acting proud, he might actually toss him aside. Jung-hyuk was too dramatic, and Dokja asked bluntly when he would be able to move on his own. Jung-hyuk answered that he would be able to move in 2 days. That made Dokja uneasy. He asked him again, almost half joking. Was Jung-hyuk planning to kill him then? But Jung-hyuk didn't reply. Inside his mind, Dokja started to worry. The silence was nerve-wracking. He had meant that as a joke, but now he wasn't so sure. That silence made everything worse. Dokja told him that he couldn't help him if this was how he planned to act. How could he offer help to someone who wanted him dead? Then Dokja made a proposal. If Jung-hyuk wanted his help, he would need to agree to an oath of existence, a sacred pledge not to kill Dokja until the end of this regression. Jung-hyuk refused. He said he couldn't take that oath. Dokja cursed under his breath. He couldn't believe how stubborn Jung-hyuk was, so Dokja lowered the condition. He asked him to at least swear not to kill him until the end of the 5th scenario. If Jung-hyuk couldn't even do that, then Dokja would stop helping him right then and there. After a brief pause, Jung-hyuk finally agreed. He gave his word. The moment the oath was made, blue flames rose from Jung-hyuk's body. The oath of existence was a serious contract. The cold flame pierced into Jung-hyuk's heart, ready to burn him from within if he broke the promise. It was a terrifying penalty, but Jung-hyuk accepted it without complaint. Dokja let out a sigh of relief. For now, he was safe. But then Jung-hyuk spoke again. He said he wouldn't kill Dokja, but he still planned to get back at him for the punch earlier. Dokja responded with nervous humor, asking for just one punch, nothing too serious. If that was enough to settle things between them, then he would accept it, but deep down, he hoped that one punch wouldn't be the end of him. Shortly after they left Gangnam, Dokja and Soo-young crossed the Cheongdam Bridge and entered Gwangjin-gu. As they moved further into the new district, Dokja noticed that the environment had changed again. The surroundings no longer resembled the ruined streets of Seoul. The usual stench of rotting corpses was gone. Instead, there was a sharp, foul smell of monster waste filling the air. The ground was no longer plain asphalt. Lush green grass had started growing through the cracks in the road. High above, the trunk of a massive plant had burst through the earth and coiled itself around the tall buildings, reaching the rooftops like a snake strangling concrete. A sudden message appeared before Dokja's eyes. A system notification. A tier 7 monster named Yanaspleta was aware of his presence and had grown wary. That was a sign of danger. Dokja warned Soo-young to be careful. He knew from experience that as long as they didn't make any aggressive moves, they could avoid a direct fight. But she needed to make sure she didn't step on any roots of the plant-like being. It was clear now that Kronos, another world, had begun its terraforming process. Terraforming was part of the 5th scenario. This scenario wasn't just about surviving in Korea. It was a grand battle between worlds. Earth, as people once knew it, was being overwritten by invading universes. Seoul was being absorbed into Kronos. China was currently facing an invasion by the 3rd Wuxia world, and Japan would soon fall under the attack of the White Demon world. Soo-young cursed under her breath, frustrated that no matter where they went, the landscape was being overtaken by otherworldly forces. Dokja explained that the awakening of the catastrophe had probably accelerated the entire process. The invaders were moving faster now. She asked who might be behind such chaos, and Dokja reminded her that people like her existed, people who stirred up events without thinking about the cost. After all, she was the one who had awakened the fire dragon back then. Soo-young fired back, saying Dokja had dealt with the fire dragon without much trouble, but Dokja disagreed. The only reason he had survived that time was because a mid-level dokkaebi had stepped in and placed a penalty on the dragon. The battle had been intense. It wasn't as easy as Soo-young made it sound, especially since she hadn't been the one to face the beast directly. He reminded her of that. She also questioned whether they could count on a similar intervention this time. Would the dokkaebis help again? Dokja doubted it. He said that penalties wouldn't work on the catastrophe of questions, and the dokkaebis were unlikely to offer support any longer. As they continued moving, Dokja noticed that many of the monsters along their path had already been defeated. He realized that Jung-hyuk must have fought them earlier while searching for him. Even in his injured condition, Jung-hyuk had cleared the area. That fact left a strange impression on Dokja. Through the team chat, Dokja finally reached out to Jung-hyuk. There was something he had been meaning to ask. With Jung-hyuk so close to death, Dokja had expected him to give up and regress. But instead, he had come all the way to find him. Dokja wanted to know why. Jung-hyuk's answer was filled with pride. He said that if he had been someone who gave up easily, he wouldn't have even started his journey. Those words reminded Dokja of something important. Inwardly, Dokja reflected on the Junghyuk he had known from the novel 3 Ways to Survive the Apocalypse. That version of Junghyuk, the one who had lived through 7 regressions, never gave up no matter how much he suffered. But the reason he had become so ruthless was because of the pain and tragedy he had endured. He had been worn down mentally over time. He had killed without hesitation because of that damage. But the Junghyuk standing before him now was still human, still holding on to hope and dreams. He was different. For a long time, Dokja believed he understood everything about Junghyuk, but in that moment he realized something new. Maybe he didn't understand this version of Junghyuk as well as he thought. Junghyuk finally answered Dokja's question. He said that when he was on the brink of death, the first person who came to his mind was Dokja. Junghyuk remembered the way Dokja had once destroyed the ruler's throne without hesitation. That act had proven Dokja's boldness. Dokja had expected something else. He had thought Junghyuk would scold him for destroying the throne back then, but Junghyuk had no interest in rehashing old decisions. He said there was no point in arguing over the past. In fact, he had thought the throne was a nuisance anyway. He had figured that Dokja destroyed it to stop the influence of the otherworld god. As Dokja listened to Junghyuk speak so calmly and logically, a thought crossed his mind. This was the first serious conversation he was having with Junghyuk, and it made him wonder. Was Junghyuk always this clear-headed? He had always seemed powerful, but now he was showing a surprising level of insight. It was unexpected. Junghyuk admitted that while destroying the throne might have made sense at the time, the consequences afterward had become more complicated. Because the throne was gone, the guides had scattered, and the effort to gather the meteorites had been delayed. That delay had caused the terraforming process to speed up unnaturally. The Wanderers had gotten hold of the meteorites' power, and that was accelerating the spread of otherworldly territory. Dokja knew that simply using the power of a meteorite shouldn't be enough to make terraforming go faster, so he asked Junghyuk what was really going on. Junghyuk then revealed a key detail. One of the 10 evils had taken possession of a meteorite. That news caught Dokja's attention immediately. He asked if it was the poison beauty, Lee Solhwa. Junghyuk confirmed it. Dokja understood right away. Solhwa was the only one capable of using the rare and deadly Thousand Spirit poison, but something didn't make sense. If Junghyuk had known that it was her, he would never have fought her directly. Dokja asked how she had managed to infect him. Junghyuk's answer was simple. He had tried to speak to her. That surprised Dokja. Junghyuk wasn't the type to talk things out, but now it made more sense. Junghyuk had tried to make Solhwa an ally. As Dokja thought about that possibility, his memory returned. He remembered that in the second round, Solhwa, the poisoner, had been one of Junghyuk's trusted companions. The 10 evils weren't always enemies. Just like how Gong Pildu, the master of the armed fortress, had changed in this round, Solhwa too had become a companion in several regressions, even in the first one. Out of all the people Junghyuk met across timelines, Solhwa was one of the few who remained by his side again and again. She was someone he could rely on. Dokja looked at Junghyuk and admitted something to himself. What Junghyuk had done, trying to talk to Solhwa instead of fighting, felt completely out of character for him. It was not like him to act that way. Junghyuk quietly agreed. He knew it was pathetic. Still, he had done it anyway. There was a pause between them. Then Junghyuk confessed something deeper. The woman he met wasn't the Solhwa he once knew, but for just a brief moment he had wanted to believe. He wanted to believe that she was still the same person from his memories, the one who had once been his companion, someone he trusted. Dokja understood. The emotions behind Junghyuk's words weren't lost on him. He told Junghyuk that he could relate. Junghyuk narrowed his eyes and asked if Dokja had ever regressed. The way Dokja spoke made it sound like he knew exactly how it felt to go through those lonely cycles. But Dokja simply said that you don't need to be a regressor to understand emotions like that. Inwardly though, Dokja was conflicted. He knew he shouldn't use such words lightly, not with someone like Junghyuk. Yet, part of him felt that Junghyuk had never truly been understood by anyone before, and maybe he never would. That's why, even if he wasn't a regressor, Dokja thought it was okay to say that he understood, at least this once. Junghyuk didn't back down. He said it was strange. He was sure that Dokja wasn't a regressor, but still, the way Dokja talked, it was like he had insight no ordinary person could have. Junghyuk guessed it must be one of Dokja's abilities as a prophet, but even so, he reminded Dokja that he wouldn't lower his guard. After all, Dokja was the man who had once taken his sister away. Dokja immediately denied the accusation. He had only been protecting her, and to make his point, he reminded Junghyuk of his lie detection skill. That skill should have told him that Dokja was telling the truth. But before the conversation could go any further, the tense voice of Suyang broke through the moment. She called out to Dokja with urgency. Their group had reached a high vantage point where they could see the road stretching from from Cheonho Bridge to Gangdong. The great hole in the sky was glowing with intense light, and something massive had just fallen toward Gangdong-gu. Dokja cursed under his breath. The situation was progressing faster than expected. Soo-young asked whether they had arrived too late, if the catastrophe had already awakened, but Dokja didn't think so. If the catastrophe had awakened, the scenario system would have started by now. That hadn't happened, which meant there was still a chance. Then he saw something on the ground, a mark, a symbol that signified that they had entered Seolhwa's territory. The poison beauty had moved quicker than anyone had predicted. From the way her forces had set up their defenses, Dokja could tell that taking the meteorite wouldn't be simple. This was going to be a serious fight. Soo-young asked if he had a plan. Dokja explained that they didn't need to defeat everyone. Their only goal was to steal the meteorite. He would stay behind to hold off the enemy while the others went for the target. Jung-hyuk remained calm despite the growing tension. He told Dokja that there was no need to rush. Even if the catastrophe began, the catastrophe of questions could be stopped quickly, but Dokja was alarmed. He questioned how such a dangerous threat could be suppressed so easily, especially when Jung-hyuk was clearly injured. Jung-hyuk, however, didn't seem worried. He pointed out that Dokja himself would be the one to do it. That had been Dokja's plan all along, hadn't it? Dokja was caught off guard. He demanded to know why Jung-hyuk believed that. Jung-hyuk's answer was direct. He assumed Dokja had already awakened the guide and learned the skill called Path of the Wind. Inwardly, Dokja guessed that Jung-hyuk was probably irritated. That skill was likely something Jung-hyuk had planned to learn himself. He must have been upset that Dokja had taken the opportunity first. But Dokja told him the truth. He hadn't learned it. Jung-hyuk was surprised. Dokja had enough time to do so. If it was a matter of understanding, Jung-hyuk offered to explain the theories behind it. Yet Dokja stopped him. It wasn't because of knowledge or time. It was because he lacked the talent for it. This answer seemed to frustrate Jung-hyuk. His voice raised slightly, and Dokja could feel the heavy pressure behind his words. Though he couldn't see Jung-hyuk's face, he felt his sharp glare boring into the back of his head. Then something shifted. Soo-young suddenly spoke. She noticed movement and warned the group. They were deep inside the territory of one of the 10 evils, so naturally, the people approaching had to be part of the enemy group. Knowing that Jung-hyuk was still recovering, Dokja handed him over to Soo-young's avatar. He told her to take care of him while he stepped forward to face whatever was coming. As the figures grew closer, something felt off. Then, a woman's clear voice echoed across the space. She was shouting for everyone to run towards Cheonho Bridge. This group wasn't from the Poison Beauty's forces. Whoever they weren't here to fight, but to flee. Panic filled their faces as they rushed past, gasping for breath. One of the unarmed survivors begged them to move aside and make way. But before they could fully pass, disaster struck. A terrible sound cut through the air. Arrows. One of the fleeing men collapsed on the spot. His body convulsed briefly before his back turned black. The skin around the wound had already begun to rot. The arrows were laced with poison. Shouts came from behind. The poisoner's group was in pursuit. Dozens of enemies, both men and women, chased after the survivors, launching another wave of arrows without hesitation. Dokja and the others moved quickly, taking cover behind a nearby building. But just as the arrows were about to rain down on them, something unexpected happened. Threads of shimmering silk filled the sky. Dozens of strong, sharp threads weaved through the air like a trap. The arrows collided into them and got caught mid-flight. Not a single one made it through. The sight left Soo-young stunned. She had never seen such a technique before. But these threads were not from the enemies. They were launched from behind the poisoner's group. The thread glinted like steel, slicing through the air with deadly precision. It wasn't just for blocking. The thread moved like a weapon, cutting through the legs of several attackers. Screams rang out as their bodies dropped. All the threads led back to one figure. A woman in a tight black combat suit flew through the air, her body almost dancing as she rode the threads. She held knives that extended from her fingers, and she moved with grace and perfect control. The length of the threads shifted at her will, wrapping around her enemies and tearing through them like paper. In just a few moments, the poisoner's group was wiped out. Dokja, trying to understand who this powerful person was, quickly opened her character profile, but strangely, there was no information. She didn't even appear on the character list. Soo-young began to speak, confused, but Dokja already knew. He recognized the figure the moment he truly looked at her. It was Yu Senga. They had only been apart for 2 days, but something about her had changed completely. She no longer looked like the gentle office worker he once knew. This woman was sharp, deadly, and completely transformed. And yet, she was still Senga. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.